The advertisement had appeared in the Boston Courier on a Tuesday morning in March, tucked between a notice for a seamstress position and an announcement regarding the city waterworks. Abigail had read it 3 times before setting the paper down, and then she had picked it up again. Seeking educated woman of good character for bookkeeping and correspondence work. Ranch operations, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. Salary negotiable. Travel provided. Inquire to Box 441, Post Office, Boston. She had inquired. What followed was a series of letters that seemed, in retrospect, almost embarrassingly credible. The handwriting was steady and formal. The stationery was quality paper. The terms described were reasonable, $40 a month, room and board included, the work involving ledger management and communication with suppliers on behalf of a ranch owner who, as the letters explained, was a man more comfortable on horseback than behind a writing desk. Abigail had not been looking for adventure. She had been looking for income. Her father had died the previous autumn, leaving behind a house with a mortgage she couldn't pay, and a reputation as a man who owed money to half the neighborhood. She had spent 6 months trying to keep the house, taking in mending work, tutoring the children of families who could barely afford it themselves, writing letters to relatives who wrote back with sympathy and very little else. By February, she understood that the house was gone regardless of what she did, and she began looking for a path that didn't require her to move in with her cousin's family in a cramped apartment in Charlestown and spend the rest of her youth pretending to be grateful for the imposition. The Wyoming position seemed like providence. She negotiated her own travel arrangements, which the letter writer agreed to reimburse upon arrival. She settled her father's remaining debts, sold what furniture the creditors hadn't already claimed, and packed everything she valued into a single leather satchel. She boarded a westbound train on a Wednesday morning with $32 in her coat pocket and a feeling she was too sensible to call Hope, but couldn't quite name anything else. The contact man was supposed to meet her at the station in Cheyenne. He was not there. She waited 3 hours. She asked the station master if anyone had inquired after a woman named Mercer. No one had. She found a telegraph office and sent a wire to Box 441, Boston, knowing even as she did it that the address was almost certainly vacant by now. The reply that came back the following morning was from a postal clerk who informed her that Box 441 had been rented under a false name and abandoned. She sat in the telegraph office with the clerk's message in her hand and thought, very calmly, that she had been an idiot. Then she thought, what now? She had enough money for 2 nights at a boarding house and perhaps 1 week of meals if she was careful. She had no contacts in Wyoming. She knew no one in Cheyenne and no one between Cheyenne and the Missouri River. Her skills were real. She could keep books, manage correspondence, do arithmetic faster than most men she'd met. But skills required someone willing to give her a chance, and she had not yet discovered that Wyoming was the kind of place where that willingness came easily. By the 3rd day, she had found a temporary position helping a general store owner sort inventory, which paid 60 cents a day and gave her just enough to extend her time in Cheyenne while she wrote letters to ranches and businesses in the surrounding area. 2 of those letters generated replies. One was from a man named Harlow who ran a freighting operation north of town and wanted to inspect her qualifications in person before discussing terms. His specific phrasing gave her a cold feeling she couldn't quite articulate, so she declined. The second reply was from a ranch called the Double K, located approximately 30 miles north, whose owner indicated he was looking for someone to manage records and supplier correspondence starting the following month. The problem was the following month. She needed to eat now, and Cheyenne was burning through her reserves faster than she had anticipated. A woman at the boarding house, a widow named Mrs. Farrell, who ran the establishment with cheerful iron efficiency, suggested that Abigail might find temporary work at a ranch called Whitmore's, about 6 miles out, which was coming up on spring shearing and always needed extra hands for record work during the rush. Mrs. Farrell wrote her a brief note of introduction. Abigail hired a man with a wagon to take her out there the following morning. She never made it to Whitmore's. The wagon driver, a young man named Cleet, who smelled of tobacco and said very little for the first 4 miles, stopped the wagon in a draw between 2 ridge lines and told her, without particular drama, that she needed to get down. "What?" Abigail said. "Get down from the wagon, ma'am." She looked at him. He was already not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the tree line ahead, and something in his posture, the particular stillness of a man trying to appear unconcerned while being anything but, made the skin on her arms prickle. Two men stepped out of the timber. They were not dressed like ranch hands. They had the look of men who had been moving fast and sleeping rough, trail dirty and watchful, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from people who are accustomed to violence and do not find it surprising. One of them was tall, with a red beard. The other was shorter and heavier, with a hat pulled so low she could barely see his eyes. "Miss Mercer," the tall one said. She did not ask how he knew her name. In that moment, she understood with sudden crystalline clarity that the advertisement in the Courier, the correspondence, the letters on quality stationery, all of it had been engineered. Someone had placed an advertisement designed to attract educated women traveling alone, had maintained a fictional correspondence until she crossed half a continent, and had now arranged to collect her somewhere between Cheyenne and a ranch that probably didn't exist in any form she'd imagined. She did not know what they intended. She suspected it was nothing good. What happened next happened very fast. She jumped from the opposite side of the wagon. She was not a woman given to impulsive physical decisions. She was a bookkeeper from Boston who had spent the last 3 years hunched over ledgers in an overheated office. But something animal and absolute took over in that moment, and she landed hard on the rocky ground, stumbled, caught herself, and ran. Behind her, she heard Cleet yell something, heard the tall man swear, heard boots hitting the ground as they came after her. She ran into the timber. She had no plan beyond the timber. The timber was away from them, and that was sufficient reasoning. She was fast, faster than she'd expected, fear doing something useful for once, and driving her legs in a way that months of grief and financial anxiety had not. She crashed through brush, ducked under branches, found a game trail, and took it at a pace that made her lungs burn, and for perhaps 3 minutes she thought she might actually outrun them. Then the trail curved back toward open ground, and she saw the third man waiting. He had been ahead of her the entire time, cutting around through the trees while the other two drove her along the trail like a rabbit toward a snare. He was older than the others, with a weathered face and flat, pale eyes, and he had a pistol in his hand, though he hadn't raised it. "Stop running," he said. "Nobody wants to hurt you." Abigail stopped. She was breathing too hard to speak. She stood on the game trail with trees on both sides and the man with pale eyes in front of her, and the sound of the other two crashing through the brush somewhere behind her, and she thought, with extraordinary clarity, that she was going to die in a Wyoming forest without anyone in the world knowing where she was. Then she heard a rifle shot. It came from somewhere above and to the right, a single crack that split the morning air and sent birds shrieking from the canopy. The man in front of her flinched, and his eyes went to the ridge above them, and in the half-second that his attention moved off her, Abigail stepped sideways into the brush. The second shot came before the first echo had died. This one hit something. She heard the thud of it, heard the tall man behind her yell in what sounded more like surprise than pain, and then hoofbeats, hard, fast, the ground-eating rhythm of a horse moving at a dead run down a slope that no sane person would take at that speed. She crouched in the brush and watched. The rider came over the ridge at a pace that made her stomach clench. He was not a large man, though he carried himself as if space accommodated him rather than the other way around. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that the sun and cold had worked over thoroughly, and a lever-action rifle that he reloaded one-handed while his horse was still in full gallop in a way that suggested he had done this many times before and was not particularly excited about it. He did not announce himself. He did not say anything at all. He simply rode between her and the three men, and his horse, a big gray with an ugly Roman nose and absolutely no apparent fear of gunfire, planted itself sideways across the trail like a barricade, and the rider looked at the three men with an expression that contained nothing whatsoever. Not anger, not aggression, just the flat, absolute assessment of a man calculating odds. "You're trespassing," he said. The man with pale eyes looked at the rifle, looked at the rider, looked at his two companions, one of whom was clutching his arm where the shot had apparently grazed him, and made a decision. They left. Not at a run, because running would have felt like surrender, but at the particular rapid walk of men who have suddenly discovered pressing business elsewhere. When they were gone, the rider looked down at her. She was still crouching in the brush. She became aware of this and straightened up, which was somewhat complicated because her legs were shaking in a way she found humiliating and couldn't stop. "You hurt?" he said. "No," she said. "I don't think so." She looked down at herself. Hands scratched from the brush, skirt torn at the hem, both knees of her stocking shredded, and revised, "Nothing serious." He studied her for a moment with the same expression he'd used on the three men, as if she were something that required assessment, but not yet a response. Then he said, "Where were you headed?" "Whitmore's ranch. I was hired on for shearing season." She paused. "Or I thought I was. The situation has become less clear." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. "How'd you end up in this draw?" The wagon driver apparently had prior commitments. She heard her own voice and was surprised to find it steady. "I should have read the situation earlier. That's on me." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the ridge above them, and then at the trail the three men had taken, and then back at her. "Silas Kane," he said. "I run the Kane spread about 2 miles north. You can't walk to Whitmore's from here without crossing 4 miles of open ground, and those men may not be done with you." "I know," she said. "I'll take you to Whitmore's tomorrow. Tonight you can sleep in the hayloft. My housekeeper can find you something to eat." It was the least romantic offer of shelter she had ever received. It was also, in that moment, the best offer she had received in 6 months. "Abigail Mercer," she said. "Boston. I'm grateful for the assistance." He nodded once, as if gratitude were a thing that required acknowledgement but not discussion, and moved his horse to make room for her to climb up behind him. She had been on a horse perhaps 4 times in her life, all of them in organized settings with gentle animals and patient instructors. This horse was neither gentle nor patient, and she grabbed Silas Kane's coat with both hands and held on with the grim determination of someone who has already survived 2 crises that morning and refuses to fall off a horse. He didn't say anything about her grip. She didn't let go, but the Kane spread was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Some rough collection of boards and ambition, perhaps, like most frontier operations she'd read about. What she found instead was a property that had clearly been built over years by someone who understood what he was doing. A main house of weathered timber with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, a bunkhouse beyond that, outbuildings arranged in the logical progression of a working operation, and beyond it all, the spread of grazing land running up into hills that turned purple and gray in the afternoon light. It was also, she noticed immediately, in a state of controlled deterioration. The fences in the home paddock needed mending. 2 of the outbuildings had been repaired with green lumber that hadn't seasoned properly and was already warping. The bunkhouse roof had a tarp over one section. These were not the signs of neglect. Whoever maintained this place worked hard and knew what they were doing, but of an operation that was doing its absolute best with insufficient resources, the way a skilled tailor can only do so much with cheap cloth. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything, automatically, without deciding to, because observation was simply how her mind moved through the world. The housekeeper was a Tejana woman of about 50 named Rosaria, who had apparently been on the Kane property since before Silas had full ownership of it. She fed Abigail without making her feel like a charity case, which Abigail appreciated more than she could express, and showed her to a room that was small but clean and had a window that looked out over the grazing land. It was not the hayloft. Rosaria had apparently overruled the hayloft suggestion without discussion. "He said the hayloft," Abigail told her. "He says a lot of things," Rosaria said, and left. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed in the small, clean room and allowed herself, for the first time all day, to feel how frightened she had been. Her hands shook for about 2 minutes. Then she breathed, very deliberately, until they stopped. She was alive. She was safe for tonight. Tomorrow was a problem she would address tomorrow. She did not go to Whitmore's. She intended to. In the morning she dressed and gathered her satchel and came downstairs to find Silas Kane already at the table with coffee and what appeared to be several weeks' worth of ranch correspondence spread in front of him in a state of disorder that made her fingers itch. He looked up. "Hungry?" "Yes, and ready when you are." Weather turned. He said it flatly, as if weather were a personal affront he was choosing not to escalate. "Road to Whitmore's will be muddy. We'll give it a day." She looked out the window. The sky had gone the color of pewter overnight, and the wind was throwing handfuls of sleet against the glass. He was right. Walking or riding to Whitmore's in this was not reasonable. She sat down and poured coffee and looked at the papers spread across the table. "Are those in any particular order?" she said. He glanced at the papers as if noticing them. "No." "May I?" A pause. "Help yourself." She pulled the nearest stack toward her and began sorting. Invoices here, receipts there, correspondence separated by sender. It took her about 20 minutes to impose basic organization on what turned out to be 8 months of accumulated paperwork. Silas said nothing during this process. He drank coffee and watched her with the same assessing look he seemed to apply to most things. And when she had finished and the table was covered in tidy, categorized stacks, he said, "You do that fast." "It's what I do," she said. He looked at the organized stacks for a moment. Then he looked at the window. "Road'll probably be clear by tomorrow." "Probably," she agreed. Neither of them said anything else. She picked up the nearest stack of invoices and began reviewing them, partly because she was curious and partly because sitting idle while someone else's paperwork moldered in front of her was a form of suffering she found more acute than most people would have understood. What she found in the invoices made her go still. She set that stack down and picked up another. Then the receipts. Then the correspondence with the bank, which was folded into an envelope that bore the return address of the Territorial Trust Company in Cheyenne. She sat with the bank letter in her hands and looked out the window for a moment. "Mr. Kane," she said. He was at the window now, watching the sleet. How long has the ranch been running at a loss?" A silence that she could feel the shape of. He didn't turn around. "What makes you think it is?" The bank letter from October, the payment arrangement they're describing, the discrepancy between your feed invoices and your cattle receipts from last fall's drive. She set the letter down. "I'm not prying. You can tell me it's not my business and I'll stop. I can see it in these numbers. I spent 3 years doing accounts for a shipping company in Boston, and the pattern is familiar." He turned from the window and looked at her. His face was not easy to read. She had begun to understand this about him, that his expressions occupied a narrow bandwidth that required close attention. What she saw now was not anger. It was something more complicated, the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for long enough that having someone else name it is more strange than relieving. "Been running hard since my father passed," he said. 3 years ago. He left the operation in good shape, but we had 2 bad winters and a dry summer, and I lost more cattle than I can replace easy. The bank's been patient." "For how much longer?" A pause. "Not long." She looked at the stacks of organized paper in front of her. She thought about the tarp on the bunkhouse roof and the warped outbuilding boards and the fences in the home paddock. She thought about the road to Whitmore's, which would probably clear by tomorrow. "I can look at these more carefully," she said. "If you want. I'm not promising anything, but I'm good with numbers and I might see something you've missed." He studied her for a long moment. She had the sense he was running calculations of his own, though the variables were different from hers. "All right," he said. She pulled the nearest stack toward her and went back to work. The road to Whitmore's cleared 3 days later. By then she had a fairly complete picture of the Kane Ranch's financial position, which was not as dire as the worst numbers suggested, but was substantially worse than the best ones implied. She had also stopped thinking about Whitmore's except in the abstract way one thinks about a path not taken. Silas had not asked her to stay. She had not asked to. It had simply stopped being the conversation they were having. His name carried a particular weight in that part of Wyoming. She understood this gradually, through accumulated evidence rather than any single source. Rosaria mentioned it once, matter-of-factly. "People here, they know the name Kane. They don't give Silas trouble." One of the ranch hands, a taciturn Pole, named Wierzbicki, who managed the horses and communicated primarily through expressions, mentioned once that the previous owner of a neighboring property had attempted to run cattle across Kane land without permission and had received a visit that ended the practice permanently. A storekeeper in the nearest town, Caldwell's Crossing, treated Silas with a deference that clearly had nothing to do with his current financial state and everything to do with some older bedrock understanding of the man's nature. The ranch hands were a small crew, 6 men, where a spread this size probably needed 12. And they treated Silas with a respect that stopped just short of the kind of rigid formality men use when they're afraid. They weren't afraid of him, she thought. They simply understood that certain things were not negotiable around Silas Kane, and they had structured their behavior accordingly, and the arrangement seemed to work for everyone. She watched him work. She couldn't help it. He moved through the ranch with a quality of attention that she found unexpectedly interesting, always aware of what was around him, noticing things, deciding things. He didn't waste motion. He didn't explain himself unless explaining was necessary. When something needed to be done, he did it, and when it was done, he moved to the next thing. And this cycle repeated from before sunrise until after dark with a consistency that made her tired just to observe. His manner with her was direct and not unfriendly, and kept a careful distance that she recognized as deliberate. He was not impolite. He was not cold. He simply treated her the way he treated most things, as a known quantity that required appropriate management but not excessive attention. She was not sure how she felt about being a known quantity. She was not sure she was. They talked, some evenings. Not about large things, not at first. About the accounts. She had begun keeping the books properly, with Silas's acknowledgement, if not his formal request, because the alternative was watching a salvageable situation worsen for lack of organization. About the ranch's history, which he described in the clipped, non-sentimental way of someone relaying facts rather than memories. His father had built the original structure. His mother had died when he was 12. He had taken over operation of the ranch at 23 when his father's health began declining and had run it for 9 years before the death made the transfer official. "You grew up here," she said one evening. They were at the table, she with the ledger and he with a cup of coffee he'd been working on for an hour. "Born here," he said. "Never lived anywhere else. Do you want to?" He considered the question seriously, which she was learning was how he treated questions in general. "No," he said. "This is the work I know how to do. I'm not sure I'd be much use somewhere else." "You'd learn. Maybe." He looked at the ledger. "What about you? Boston? You miss it?" "Parts of it," she said honestly. "My father's house. Certain streets. A library on Boylston Street I used to spend time in." She paused. "Not the job. The job was fine, but fine isn't the same as, I don't know, not the same as right." "And is this?" he said. "Right?" She looked around the kitchen, at Rosaria's herbs drying from the ceiling beams, at the window full of Wyoming night, at the ledger she was keeping for a man she'd met 4 days ago in the middle of a catastrophic morning. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me again in a month." He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned back to his coffee. She had been on the ranch for 11 days when she found the discrepancy. She almost missed it. It was buried in the receipts from the previous fall's cattle drive. A single line item in a payment record from the stockyards that didn't match the corresponding entry in the ledger. The difference was $47, which in the context of a $1,000 transaction seemed like an error, except that when she traced the error forward through 6 months of accounts, it accumulated into a pattern. Someone had been skimming, not a lot, and not obviously. Small amounts from multiple sources, adjusted to look like rounding errors or recording mistakes, distributed across enough transactions that no casual review would catch it. She sat with the evidence spread across the table for an hour, checking and rechecking before she went to find Silas. He was in the far paddock checking fence. She walked out there and waited until he'd finished the section he was working on, because interrupting work mid-task seemed wrong, and then she said, "I need to show you something in the accounts." He looked at her face. "How bad?" "Not catastrophic, but you've been robbed, and whoever did it knew your books well enough to hide it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." They went back to the kitchen and she laid out the evidence, the specific transactions, the pattern of adjustments, the accumulated loss which she had calculated at approximately $380 over 8 months. He looked at everything she showed him, asking questions that demonstrated he understood exactly what he was looking at, and when she was done he sat back and looked at the ceiling. "Harlow," he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Man who used to do my accounts." "Harlow. He left last October." Silas's expression had not changed, but there was something different in it now, a particular quality of stillness. Said he had other opportunities. She thought about the man named Harlow who ran a freighting operation north of Cheyenne, who had wanted to inspect her qualifications in person. The cold feeling came back. "I think I may have received a letter from that man," she said carefully. Silas looked at her. "A letter." "In Cheyenne, when I was looking for work." She thought about it. "I didn't reply. Something about the phrasing felt wrong." He was quiet again, long enough that she wondered if she'd said something he disagreed with. Then, "You have good instincts." I learned to, she said. The hard way, some of it. He picked up her neatly documented evidence of the fraud and looked it over again. I'll deal with Harlow, he said. The tone was not threatening exactly. It was simply final, the way closing a door is final. What else? She pulled the main ledger toward her. Sit down, she said. I'll show you what I've been thinking about the spring accounts. He sat. She opened the ledger. Outside, the Wyoming wind had shifted direction, pushing the smell of pine and cold dirt through the window, and from somewhere across the grazing land, one of the horses was raising its voice about something it objected to. Abigail Mercer, who had come to Wyoming with $32 and a letter that turned out to be a lie, looked at the numbers in front of her and began talking. The fire started in the main barn on a Thursday night in early April. She woke to the smell first, the dense, complex smell of burning hay and old wood, and was out of bed and to the window before she was fully awake. The barn was perhaps 60 yards from the house, and in the darkness it was a solid block of orange light, the fire already inside the walls and moving fast. She could hear the cattle in the outer pens, the panicked sounds of animals that understand fire in some fundamental way that does not require experience. She was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes. Silas was already at the barn, which meant he had either been awake or woke faster than she did. Wierzbicki and 2 of the other hands were with him. They had given up on saving the structure, so she could see that in the way they were working, and were concentrating on getting the horses out of the attached stable before the fire reached it. She ran toward the paddock where the cattle were and found the gate latch and got it open. Because letting panicked cattle mill in a pen with fire 40 yards away is a way to have your cattle injure themselves on each other and the fence. One of the hands she didn't know well, a young man named Duff, who was newer to the ranch than the others, came up beside her. What do you need? Help me push them further from the barn, she said. Don't spook them more than they already are. They moved the cattle back together. The barn burned. By the time the structure collapsed inward, a sound like a held breath releasing, they had gotten all the horses out and the cattle far enough back. No animals lost. The barn itself was total. The grain stores, the tools, 3 months of accumulated hay supply, gone. She stood in the dark with Silas and watched the last of it burn, the collapsed frame settling into coals. His face in the fire's light was absolutely unreadable. After a while, she said quietly, Was this an accident? He didn't answer for a moment. Then, The main barn's been here 30 years, not one fire. He was looking at the coals. Everybody has accidents. Yes, she said, they do. He turned and looked at her, and what she saw in his face now was not grief, exactly, and not anger. Or not only anger. It was the look of a man who has had the particular suspicion he has been carrying confirmed and whose options have narrowed. Harlow's got associates, he said. Couple of men who've been working the territory, running a protection arrangement with some of the smaller ranches. And you refused. I don't pay men to leave me alone. That's not how I was raised. She looked at the coals of the barn. So they escalated. Seems so. She thought about the $380 in the accounts, about the 3 men on the game trail, about the pattern of events since she had arrived, which she was beginning to understand was not bad luck, but deliberate pressure, the kind of pressure that was supposed to break people before they understood the source. We need the barn rebuilt, she said, and we can't afford to rebuild it. I know that. What if we didn't pay for it, she said. He looked at her. The other ranchers, she said, how many of them have also refused the protection arrangement? A pause. 3 or 4 that I know of. Probably more that haven't said. And how many owe you a favor or would help a neighbor who'd help them back? Silas was quiet for a long time. The coals settled and shifted, sending up a brief column of sparks. You're talking about a barn raising, he said. I'm talking about a community, she said, which is different. A barn raising is one day. A community is something they can't burn down. He looked at her steadily. She had learned to hold still under that look, to not fill the silence with qualifications or apologies because he wasn't suspicious of her. He was simply thinking, and his thinking happened in a particular register that required quiet. Half of them will say no, he said. Maybe. How many do you need for 1 barn in 1 day? 20 men, working hard. Then approach 40, she said. And let me write the letters. Another silence, longer this time. You know, he said, when I found you in that draw, I thought you were going to be a problem. I am a problem, she said. I'm just your problem now instead of theirs. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was the first time she had heard it. It suited him, brief, a little reluctant, genuine. He turned back to look at what remained of the barn. Write the letters, he said. Rosaria found her at the table the next morning, already writing. The older woman stood in the doorway for a moment watching, then came in and put a cup of coffee at her elbow without comment. Abigail wrote without looking up. He told you to do this? Rosaria said. Yes. A pause. People around here don't do things for free. I know, Abigail said. I'm not asking for free. I'm asking for what neighbors do for each other. She set her pen down and looked up at Rosaria. What do they do for each other here? I'm from Boston. I don't actually know. Rosaria considered this. They help when it's bad enough and they believe the person deserves it. She looked at Abigail for a moment. You think they'll come? I think some of them will, Abigail said. Some is enough. Rosaria made a sound that was not agreement and was not disagreement and went back to whatever she had been doing before. Abigail picked up her pen. She wrote 8 letters. She wrote them carefully, not begging and not commanding, simply describing what had happened and what was needed, and what she understood about neighbors who were facing the same pressures from the same source. She was honest about the fire and did not hide that she suspected it wasn't an accident. She was honest about the Kane Ranch's situation without being self-pitying about it. She wrote the kind of letter she would have wanted to receive if she were one of those ranchers, practical, clear, without dramatics. Silas took the letters to town the next morning. She did not go with him. She stayed and helped Rosaria and went over the accounts again, looking for places where they could cut costs without cutting operations, and waited. The first response came 3 days later, then 2 more. By the end of the week, she had confirmations from 14 families. Silas set the last letter down on the table and looked at her. 14, he said. 14, she agreed. I said half would say no. 14 is more than half. He sat down across from her. You have a way with people, he said. It sounded less like a compliment than an observation, the way he might note that a horse had good ground manners. I have a way with words, she said. People are considerably more complicated. You wrote like you knew them. I wrote like I was one of them, she said. Because I am. I'm also on a ranch that just lost its barn and can't rebuild alone and is facing pressure from men who think isolation is a weapon. She looked at him. That's not a Kane problem. That's a problem every one of them has. He looked at the 14 confirmations spread across the table. Outside, one of the hands was cutting wood, the axe strokes rhythmic and steady. Barn raising is in 2 weeks, he said, assuming nobody changes their mind. Some might, she said. We'll need to follow up. You'll follow up, he said. Not a question. I'll follow up, she agreed. He stood up and picked up his hat and went back outside, and Abigail Mercer pulled the next stack of work toward her and kept going. The day of the barn raising was a Saturday in late April, cold and clear. She had been awake since 4. Rosaria had been awake before her, and by the time the first wagons appeared on the road at sunrise, there was coffee enough for 50 people and food enough for more. Abigail stood on the covered porch and watched them come, wagons and riders, families and single men, people she had met in the weeks since her arrival and people she hadn't, and felt something she hadn't expected, not pride, something quieter. The sense that she had correctly understood something about this place and these people and the nature of what connected them, and that understanding had been sufficient to move something that couldn't have been moved through any other mechanism. She did not have time to feel it for long. The morning was organized chaos, lumber being sorted and men arguing cheerfully about the best approach to the frame, and children running between legs while their parents worked, and Rosaria and 2 other women she'd recruited running a continuous supply of food that kept the workers moving. Abigail was everywhere, managing, problem-solving, answering questions, smoothing over the one argument that threatened to stop work for 20 minutes until she intervened with a solution that satisfied both parties without requiring either to lose face. Silas worked the hardest of anyone. She noticed this without being surprised by it. Of course, he worked the hardest. It was his barn. And she noticed also the way the other men looked at him when they thought he wasn't watching. With something like respect, yes, but also with the particular attention people pay to someone they are reassessing. The man who had seemed like a losing proposition, a neighbor in trouble, had become something else in the course of a morning. He was still in trouble. The barn wouldn't fix that. But he was not alone, and that was different. By 4 in the afternoon, the frame was up. By 6, the walls were standing. The roof would take another day of work from Silas's own hands, but the structure existed where that morning there had been only ash and cleared ground. People didn't leave right away. They ate, went talked, and the children ran until they collapsed. And Abigail moved through it all, learning names, learning histories, filing away the information that would become useful later in ways she couldn't quite predict yet. A woman named Celia Marsh found her near the food table. Celia was the wife of a rancher from the eastern side of the valley, somewhere around 40, with the kind of face that had always been plain and had improved with age. "You're the one who wrote the letters," Celia said. "I am," Abigail said. Celia looked at her steadily. "You've been here what? A month?" "Not quite." "And you know us well enough to ask for this?" It was not entirely a friendly observation. Abigail met it directly. "I know you well enough to understand that what's happening on this ranch is also happening to your neighbors, and that isolation is what makes all of you weaker. I don't think that requires being from here." Celia looked at her for another moment. Then something in her expression shifted. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." She extended her hand. "Celia Marsh, my husband Garrett thinks the new frame is solid work." "Tell him I'm glad," Abigail said, and shook her hand. Later, when everyone had gone and the light had dropped below the ridge and she and Silas were standing in the yard looking at the new frame against the darkening sky, he said, "People are talking about you." "I know," she said. "Some of it's not kind." "I know that too." She looked at the frame, pale new lumber, the smell of cut wood in the cold air. "Does it bother you?" He thought about it. "Not much," he said. "People talk. They'll stop when there's something more interesting to talk about." "Will there be?" He looked at the frame a moment longer. Then he looked at her. "Probably," he said. "Things tend to happen around you." She couldn't entirely argue with that. She thought about the game trail, and the letters, and the barn raising, and the 14 families who had come when asked, and she thought about the men who had burned the barn and whether they knew yet that their plan had produced the opposite of its intended effect. "Yes," she said, "I think they do." He turned and went inside, and she stood in the yard a moment longer, looking at the new frame, listening to the Wyoming night come in around her. She was still looking for something. She hadn't found it yet, but she was beginning to think that whatever it was, she was in the right place to look. The lumber for the barn roof arrived on a Monday, and by Wednesday, Silas had the first section nailed and the second one started, working mornings before the wind picked up and evenings until the light failed entirely. Abigail watched him from the yard sometimes, not because she had nothing else to do, but because there was something in the way he worked that she was still trying to understand. That absolute, unself-conscious commitment to the task in front of him, as if the concept of doing less than everything had never occurred to him. And he couldn't imagine why it would. She had plenty of her own work. The accounts she had organized in the first weeks were now a living system rather than a historical record, which meant there were decisions to make with the numbers she was tracking, and decisions required information, and information required conversations she hadn't had yet. She started with Wierzbicki. The horseman was not an easy conversationalist. He was somewhere in his late 40s, powerfully built in the shoulders and diminishing from there, with a face that had been lived in hard. His English was functional, but he chose his words the way a frugal man chooses purchases, deliberately and without excess. She found him in the stable one morning when she came to feed the 2 horses she had taken on as a personal responsibility, partly because someone needed to, and partly because she had decided that being useful in concrete ways that could be seen and assessed, was more valuable right now than being useful in abstract ones. "Wierzbicki," she said, "what do we need that we're not getting?" He looked at her for a long moment, his face doing the thing it did where it appeared to be deciding whether to engage. "Many things," he said. "Start with the horses." He started with the horses. It took 40 minutes, and by the end she had 4 pages of notes in the ledger she carried everywhere now, and a considerably clearer understanding of why the operation's efficiency had been declining in ways that weren't visible from the accounts alone. The equipment problems, the shortage of hands, the particular way that being stretched too thin produced cascading small failures that never showed up as a single catastrophic line item, but accumulated across 100 minor inefficiencies into something that quietly strangled a healthy operation. She went to Duff next, the young hand who had helped her push the cattle back from the fire. He was talkative in the way of people who have been waiting for someone to ask. A little too eager, telling her more than she specifically needed about the history of the ranch's cattle operation, but useful for exactly that reason. He had a good memory and cared about the work, which was more than could be said for two of the other hands, who she had already assessed as men who were there for a wage rather than the operation, and who would leave at the first better offer. She did not tell Silas this yet. She was still building the picture. It took her 3 more weeks to build it completely, and when she had it, she sat down at the kitchen table with the full ledger and a separate notebook she'd been keeping and looked at the total of what she knew. The ranch was running at approximately 60% of its viable operating capacity. Some of that was the debt load and the losses from the bad winters, which were structural problems without quick solutions. But a significant portion, she estimated somewhere around a third of the efficiency loss, was organizational. Poor scheduling, duplicated effort, equipment being used in the wrong sequence, feed being purchased at higher prices from a vendor who offered credit when a cash payment to a different vendor would save 12% on each order. These were fixable things, not quickly and not without friction, but fixable. She brought it to Silas on a Friday evening when the day's work was done and Rosaria had left and the kitchen was quiet. She laid the notebook on the table next to the ledger and said, "I want to show you something." He sat down and she walked him through it. He was a good listener. She had come to appreciate this about him. The kind who actually processed what he was hearing rather than waiting for his turn to respond. He asked questions that were specific and relevant, and when he disagreed with her assessment, he said so directly, which she preferred vastly to the kind of agreement that had no intention behind it. He disagreed with her about the vendor switch. "Hennessy's given me credit when I needed it," he said. "That's worth something." "It is," she said. "I'm not suggesting you cut Hennessy off. I'm suggesting you pay cash when you have cash and save the credit arrangement for when you genuinely need it. The 12% difference applied over a year is enough to cover 2 months of Duff's wages." A pause. "All right," he said. "That's fair." He disagreed more strongly about the 2 hands she'd identified as likely to leave. "Crane and Mitchell have been here 2 years," he said. "They do their work." "They do," she said. "I'm not saying fire them. I'm saying you should know that they're watching their options, and if something better comes through, they'll take it, and you should plan for that rather than be surprised." He looked at her steadily. "How do you know?" "I listen to them talk. Not deliberately. They're not secretive about it. They just don't think I'm listening. Crane's brother has a freight operation in Laramie. Mitchell's been getting letters he doesn't talk about." She shrugged. "It might be nothing, but in an operation this tight, losing 2 hands without a plan for replacement causes problems." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You pay attention to a lot of things," he said. "It's a habit," she said. "I'm sorry if it feels like I'm overstepping." "It doesn't," he said, and the evenness of it was enough that she believed him. They worked through the rest of her list. Some things he agreed to immediately. Some required negotiation. 1. Her proposal to consolidate the morning work assignments into a written schedule rather than the current system of Silas telling each man individually what was needed each day. He was skeptical about on the grounds that it felt, in his words, like the way townspeople do things. But he agreed to try it for a month. When they were done, the fire had burned low and the coffee had gone cold, and it was later than either of them had noticed. "This is a lot of work you've done," he said. He was looking at the notebook. "It's the work," she said. "This is what I do." He was quiet for a moment, in that particular way he had where the silence was doing something rather than simply occupying space. Then, "I haven't asked what you want in return." She looked at him. It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer. "I want to see if this works," she said. "I don't mean that simply. I spent 3 years in Boston keeping books for a company I had no stake in, watching decisions get made badly by people who had authority and not much else. I did the work and took the wage and went home." She looked at the ledger. "This is different. I have a stake in whether this works. I don't know how to explain it exactly. It matters differently. Botsi. He considered this. You could go to another ranch, he said. One that's in better shape. Easier. I could, she said. Do you want me to? Another silence, longer this time. No, he said. She nodded once. Then we'll see if this works. She closed the notebook and went to bed, and she lay in the small room with the Wyoming night outside the window and thought about the word stake. She had not said the thing underneath the word, which was that she had not felt this kind of engagement, this sense of being genuinely, consequentially involved, in long enough that she had begun to think she'd imagined it. The Boston job had paid her. This place was doing something different. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with that, but she was fairly sure that leave and find somewhere easier was not the right answer. She was asleep before she finished the thought. The town of Caldwell's Crossing had opinions about her, and it was not shy about sharing them. She had gathered this from small things at first. The particular quality of attention she received when she came in with Silas for supplies, the conversations that stopped or shifted when she was in range, the way certain women looked at her, and then looked at Silas, and then looked back at her with expressions that communicated entire editorials without requiring words. She was not bothered by it, exactly. She had grown up in a city large enough that anonymity was the default, and attention required effort, so Wyoming's small-town transparency was genuinely foreign to her experience, but she could read the currents even if she didn't share the same intuitions. The Caldwell's Crossing. View of Abigail Mercer, as best she could reconstruct it from evidence, ran as follows. A woman from Boston, who had shown up on Kane's ranch under unclear circumstances and had positioned herself as indispensable through methods that the more charitable locals described as clever and the less charitable ones described as suspicious. Some people seemed to think she was taking advantage of Silas, which she found amusing, because Silas Kane was approximately the last person on Earth who could be taken advantage of without being aware of it. Some seemed to think she was running some kind of scheme whose nature they hadn't quite determined yet. A small number, mostly the women who had been at the barn raising, seemed to have a more complex view. The one who expressed it most directly was Celia Marsh, who had tracked her down at the general store on a Thursday morning in May and said, without preamble, "People are saying you're running that ranch behind Silas's back." Abigail looked at her over a bolt of canvas she was considering for work aprons. "What do you think?" she said. "I think Silas Kane has never been run by anybody in his life, and wouldn't start now," Celia said. "But that's not what they're saying, and it's going to cause you problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind where men don't listen to you because they've already decided what you are." Celia picked up the edge of the canvas and rubbed it between her fingers, apparently assessing it on behalf of the apron project without being asked. "This one's too light. You want the heavier weight for work aprons." She set it down. "You should come to the church social next month." "That seems like a strange solution to my problem." "The social is where people decide what they think about each other," Celia said. "You stay away, you stay a question mark. You come, you become somebody." She shrugged. "You don't have to agree with people or be liked by them. You just have to be real enough that they can't make you into something you're not." It was better advice than Abigail would have expected, and she said so. Celia made a face. "I'm not stupid," she said. "Just because I've been in this valley my whole life doesn't mean I don't understand things." "I didn't think you were stupid," Abigail said. "I was genuinely surprised that the advice was useful, which is different." Celia looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed. A short, real sound. "All right," she said. "Come to the social. Bring something to eat. Be polite, but don't be soft, because soft reads as dishonest out here." She took that advice. The social was on the first Saturday of June, held in the yard of the Caldwell family property, which was large enough to accommodate most of the valley's population when the weather cooperated. The weather cooperated minimally. It was cold and occasionally threatening, the sky doing the Wyoming thing where it couldn't decide between spring and not. But people came anyway, because the alternative was spending another Saturday within the same four walls they spent every other day in. Silas came, which she suspected was not his preference, but which he agreed to without complaint when she mentioned it. He stood near the food table and talked to the men he knew, and endured the social obligation with the expression of a man serving a sentence he acknowledges as fair. Abigail moved. She introduced herself to people she hadn't met, reinforced her impression with people she had. She ate a portion of everything offered, because refusing food at a social event in a place where people had put effort into making it was a statement she didn't want to make. She talked about the ranch's spring work without making it sound like boasting. She asked questions and listened to the answers with genuine attention because the answers were genuinely interesting. The valley had a complexity to it that she was still learning, economic interdependencies and old alliances and older grievances, the kind of texture that only came from people living in proximity to each other over decades. A man named Del Fordham found her near the edge of the gathering in the late afternoon. He was somewhere around 50, with the build of someone who had worked hard for a long time and a face that wore a permanent expression of mild suspicion. He was, she had learned, the largest landholder in the immediate valley after Silas, and he had not come to the barn raising. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Fordham," she said. She had been wondering when he would approach her. "Settling in at Kane's," he said. "I am." "Long stay for someone who was supposed to be here one night." She looked at him steadily. Circumstances changed. He looked out over the gathering, hands in his pockets. Kane's been in trouble, financially. He has. And now he's not, as much. He glanced at her sideways. "People notice that." "I imagine they do," she said. "Some people wonder," he said, "what a woman from Boston gets out of working on a struggling Wyoming ranch." She had thought about how she would answer this question when it arrived, and she had decided not to be clever about it. Clever was interesting, but it didn't stick. "I get work that matters to me," she said. "The Boston job paid well and went nowhere. This one has a future, if we build it right. That's worth more to me than comfortable." He looked at her directly for the first time. "You believe that?" "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away again. "Kane's a stubborn man," he said. "Doesn't ask for help. The barn raising surprised people." "He didn't ask for help," she said. "He accepted it. There's a difference." Something in Fordham's expression shifted slightly. "There is," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't come to the raising." "I know. Had my reasons." "I'm sure you did," she said, and did not ask what they were because if he wanted her to know, he would say. He stood there another moment, apparently conducting some internal assessment. Then he said, "Your letters were well written. Thank you. The Harlow business." He said it carefully, the way people say the names of things they are approaching from an angle. "People know about that." "Do they?" she said. "Word gets around. Man was skimming off Kane for months before Kane knew. Then a woman from Boston comes and finds it in the accounts in her first weeks." He paused. "People find that interesting." "What kind of interesting?" "The useful kind," he said. Then he nodded, once, the way Silas nodded, a full stop rather than a gesture, and walked away. She turned this conversation over in her head for the rest of the afternoon and most of the ride home, and Silas, who had been watching from the food table and clearly knew something significant had happened, waited until they were clear of town to ask. "Fordham talk to you?" "He did." "What did he say?" "He called the letters well written and mentioned the Harlow situation." She watched the road. "I think he was deciding whether to trust me." And, "I think he may have decided maybe," which is probably the best available outcome with that particular man. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Fordham doesn't trust easy," he said. "His previous neighbor sold grazing rights to a land company without telling him, and it took him 3 years and a lawyer from Denver to get the situation untangled." "I know," she said. "Celia Marsh told me. I think that's why he didn't come to the barn raising. He doesn't make communal gestures without understanding exactly what he's committing to." He glanced at her. "Celia told you that." "Celia is very informative," she said. "You should talk to her more." "Celia talks enough for both of us," he said, and it was dry enough that she smiled. The news about Gideon Crow came in early June, on a Tuesday, in the form of Duff coming into the kitchen at mid-morning with an expression she'd learned to read as something's happened, and it's not good. "What?" she said. "Ryder just came through from the Ellery place," Duff said. "Man named Crow and some others burned Ellery's feed barn Sunday night. Left a note. Said if Ellery wanted his cattle left alone, he'd need to make arrangements." She set her pen down. "Is Ellery all right?" "He's fine." Shook up. His wife's... Duff paused. She's not doing well with it. How far is Ellery's spread from here? 8, maybe 9 miles east. 8 miles. She looked at the window, at the spring day that looked like any other spring day. Silas was in the far pasture when she found him. She told him what Duff had said and watched his face as he processed it. The things she had noticed before, the particular stillness of a man whose suspicions have been confirmed, was there again, but different this time. Grimmer. Crow, he said. You know the name. By reputation. He looked at the mountains north of the pasture. He's been working the territory north of here for a year. Moves his operation every few months, so he's hard to pin down. Shoshone County had a warrant on him last fall, but he was gone before they could serve it. How many men does he run with? 6 or 8. Changes. He turned from the mountains and looked at her. He'll work his way to us eventually. I know, she said. When is the next cattle drive? A pause. 3 weeks. I need to take a herd to the stockyards in Laramie. He stopped. She could see him calculating. It's the payment that keeps us current with the bank through fall. So you can't cancel it. No, she understood what that meant. If he left for the cattle drive, the ranch was short-handed, and a short-handed ranch with a known pattern of absence was exactly the kind of target Crow would be looking for. She thought about Ellery, 8 miles east, whose wife was not doing well with it. How long will you be gone? She said. 10 days. Maybe 12, depending on the road. She nodded. All right, she said. Go. He looked at her. I'm not sure that's... You can't stay, she said. The bank payment can't wait. I'm not without resources here. I have Wierzbicki and Duff and the others, and I know the property and I know the accounts, and I'm not easily frightened. She met his eyes. I've been managing problems since I was 22 years old, Silas. Let me manage these. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear the wind in the grass and a hawk somewhere above them and the distant sound of cattle. Anything happens, he said, send Duff to Marsh's place. Garrett Marsh will come. I know, she said, and don't try to... He stopped himself, apparently reconsidering the end of that sentence. Don't try to what? Just... He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely decode. Be careful. It was not, she thought, what he had originally intended to say, but it was what came out, and she believed he meant it. I will be, she said. Bring back enough from the stockyards to fix the east fence. It's worse than Wierzbicki's been telling you. He almost smiled. She had begun to be able to tell when it was almost. I'll look at it when I'm back, he said. I already know what it is, she said. Just bring the money. He left 4 days later at dawn, with Crane and 2 of the other hands and 112 head of cattle, and Abigail stood in the yard and watched the herd move south until the dust they raised was the only evidence they'd existed. Then she turned and went back inside and made a list of everything that needed to happen in the next 12 days. The first problem arrived on the 3rd day. The stock pond in the north pasture had been fed by a seasonal creek that came down from the hills, and for 3 days it had been running lower than it should. By the 3rd day, the cattle using that pasture had drunk it nearly dry, which was not immediately catastrophic, but would become so within 48 hours if the creek flow didn't recover. Abigail went up the creek line with Wierzbicki on the 4th morning and found what she'd suspected. A section of hillside had slumped in the spring thaw, partially blocking the channel. It wasn't a large blockage, but it was enough. Can we clear it? She asked. Wierzbicki looked at it for a while. Yes, he said. 4 men, half a day. We have 4 men, she said, and half a day before it becomes a bigger problem. They cleared it. It took most of the morning and was muddy and unpleasant work, and Duff complained about his boots with a frequency that she eventually found endearing rather than irritating. By noon, the creek was running cleanly, and the stock pond would be adequate by the following morning. The second problem arrived on the 5th day. She saw the 2 men from the covered porch at mid-afternoon. They were on horseback, moving slowly along the road that ran past the ranch's eastern boundary, and they were looking at the property with the particular quality of attention that people use when they are assessing something rather than passing through. She stood on the porch and watched them. They did not approach. After perhaps 10 minutes, they moved on. She called Duff and Wierzbicki together that evening. I don't know who those men were, she said. They may have been nothing, but I want a schedule. Someone on watch from the high ground above the barn every evening until Silas is back. 2-hour shifts, rotating. Duff looked uncertain. You think it's Crow's people? I think it might be nothing, she said. I also thought a creek blockage might fix itself. And we cleared it ourselves and saved the north herd. We do the watch. They did the watch. The two men came back on the 7th day. This time they came down the road and through the gate, not skulking, walking their horses openly like men with a purpose. And Abigail met them in the yard with Wierzbicki standing 20 feet behind her and the old shotgun from the kitchen rack in her hands, broken open across her forearm, the way she had made Wierzbicki show her 3 times until she was confident she was holding it correctly. The men pulled up when they saw her. The one in front was somewhere around 40, with a trimmed beard and a coat that had been expensive some years ago. He looked at the shotgun with an expression that was professionally neutral and said, "Ma'am, we're looking for the ranch owner. Kane, is it?" "Mr. Kane is away," she said. "Can I help you?" "When do you expect him back?" "I don't give that information to strangers," she said pleasantly. "What's your business here?" The man in front looked at the man behind him, a quick glance that communicated something, and then looked back at her. "We represent some interests in the territory. Interested in discussing arrangements with local ranches for their protection." "I see," she said. "And what would these arrangements involve?" "A monthly consideration," he said, "in exchange for which certain problems can be avoided." She looked at him for a moment. He was watching the shotgun rather than her face. "I appreciate you coming by," she said. "I'll be sure to tell Mr. Kane about your offer when he returns. Until then, I'd ask you to get off this property." "Ma'am, I said clearly," she said, and she closed the shotgun with a sound that carried. They left. Wierzbicki, standing behind her, said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then, "You know how to use that?" "He didn't know whether I did," she said. "That's what mattered." Wierzbicki made a sound that might have been a laugh in someone more demonstrative. She uncocked the shotgun carefully. She had practiced this too, and went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and waited until her hands stopped shaking before she picked up the ledger. The 8th day brought a storm. It came in from the northwest with no particular warning, the sky going from pale and windy to dark and serious within the span of 2 hours. And by the time the full weight of it arrived, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the rain was coming sideways, and the horses were unhappy, and the cattle in the east pasture needed to be moved to the windbreak before the cold got into them. She and Duff went out in it. There was no choice. The cattle needed to move, and there were 2 of them available for the work, and so they did it, in the dark, and the rain, and the particular misery of a Wyoming spring storm that reminded you Wyoming was not interested in whether you found the experience convenient. By the time they got the herd to the windbreak, she was so wet and cold that her hands had stopped working properly, and she had to grip the reins differently, which her horse found objectionable, and expressed by doing a sideways dance through the mud that she stayed on through sheer spite. Duff was 19 years old, and he was, she discovered, genuinely good at his work when the stakes were real. He moved the cattle with confidence and patience, and he kept his head even when a section of the herd spooked and split, coming around to the outside and pushing them back without making the situation worse. She filed this away. Duff was worth keeping. They got back to the barn close to midnight. She stripped off her soaked coat and hat and found Rosaria, who had returned from her daughter's house in Caldwell's Crossing when she'd heard the weather. In the kitchen, with hot coffee and a look that communicated several things without words. "Sit," Rosaria said. She sat. "You moved the east herd," Rosaria said. "Yes." "In that?" "Yes." Rosaria poured coffee and set it in front of her. "Silas would have done the same thing," she said. It sounded from Rosaria like the highest available form of praise. "I know," Abigail said. She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Is there anything to eat?" There was. There always was, where Rosaria was concerned. She ate and dried out and went to sleep at 2 in the morning and was up again at 5 because the morning work did not pause for weather or exhaustion or personal feelings about the general situation. The storm cleared on the 10th day. The east fence, which Silas had not yet fixed, had taken damage in the wind, and she spent most of the day riding the line with Wierzbicki and making temporary repairs with wire and the fence straining tools that she had made Wierzbicki teach her to use, because depending on someone else for a skill you could learn yourself was a form of vulnerability. She didn't accept. On the 11th day, a rider came from the Ellery place. He was a young man she hadn't met, one of Ellery's hands, and he arrived at the yard mid-morning with the expression of someone delivering information he found unpleasant. Crow's men had come to Ellery a second time. This time they had taken 2 cattle as a demonstration. Ellery was considering the arrangement. She thanked the rider and sent him back with a written note for Ellery that she thought about for 20 minutes before writing, not advising him what to do, because his situation was his own, and she was not going to tell a man in danger how to manage his risk, but telling him what had happened at the Kane Ranch and what she intended when Silas returned. She wanted him to know he was not alone in this. That was all the note said, essentially. Sometimes that was enough. On the 12th day, she heard the cattle drive before she saw it. She was on the covered porch with the ledger when the sound came from the south. The particular low accumulation of sound that a moving herd makes, not loud but present, 100 individual sounds that added up to something unmistakable. She set the ledger down and stood. When she could see the dust cloud, she went down to the yard to wait. Silas rode in ahead of the herd, trail dirty and tired in the way of someone who has been moving hard for days and is running on reserve. He pulled up in the yard and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and he ran his eyes over the ranch, the barn, the outbuildings, the paddock, the state of things, with the assessment of a man who has been worrying about what he'd find and is now finding it. "Well," he said. "The creek blockage in the north is fixed," she said. "East fence took storm damage. I've done temporary repairs. It needs full work next week. The stock pond is adequate. Crow's men came twice. The second time I encouraged them to leave." She paused. "I need to tell you about Ellery." He climbed down from the horse. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Complicated, containing things she could see the shape of, but not the specific content. He handed his reins to Duff, who appeared from nowhere, because Duff had a talent for materializing when he was needed. "You're all right," Silas said. "I'm fine," she said. "The ranch is fine," she said. "Or it will be. I have a list." He almost smiled at that. She could see it. And then it went away, and he looked at her again with that complicated expression. 12 days, he said. 12 days, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. The herd was coming in behind him, Crane and the other hands moving them to the home pasture, and the yard was full of noise and dust and the smell of cattle and the ordinary chaos of a drive returning home. "I don't know what you were before you came here," he said. "Boston, the job, whatever it was. But that's not what you are now." She looked at him. It was an unusual thing for him to say, given how precisely he normally chose his words. "What am I now?" she said. He considered it. "You're part of this place," he said, "whether you decided to be or not." She thought about that for a moment, about the creek and the storm and the 2 men she had faced in the yard with a shotgun she was still learning to use, about Duff in the rain and Rosaria's coffee and Wierzbicki's sound that might have been a laugh. "I know," she said, and she did. The east fence took 4 days to repair properly. Silas worked it himself, with Wierzbicki and Duff and one of the newer hands, a quiet man named Pelletier, who had shown up 2 weeks after the barn raising looking for work and had proven competent enough that Silas had taken him on without much deliberation. Abigail watched the operation from a distance on the first morning, noted that they had the work in hand, and went back to what she'd been doing, which was the note she had promised Ellery and a longer letter she was drafting to Garrett Marsh, because the conversation she intended to have with Silas about Crow required groundwork she hadn't yet laid. She had told Silas the essential facts the evening he returned from the drive: the 2 visits, the ultimatum they represented, the note she'd sent to Ellery. He had listened without interrupting, which was characteristic, and then had been quiet for a while in a way she had learned to interpret as serious processing rather than dismissal. "Ellery's considering the arrangement," he said finally. "He is," she said. "I don't blame him. He's got less room than we do, and Crow has already taken from him. If Ellery pays, Crow gets stronger and everyone else looks weaker for not paying." "Yes," she said. which is why the note I sent matters and why I need to talk to you about what comes next. What came next was the conversation she'd been building toward since the rider from Ellery's place had arrived. She laid it out that night, the same way she had laid out the barn-raising proposal. Not asking permission, exactly, but presenting the logic and letting him follow it to the same conclusion she had reached. Crow's operation worked because it operated against isolated targets. The model was simple and old. Identify operations that couldn't defend themselves without help, apply enough pressure that the cost of resistance exceeded the cost of compliance, and collect. The protection arrangement wasn't a solution for the ranchers who paid it. It was a permanent tax, and once you paid it, you had implicitly agreed to go on paying it, and Crow had the leverage to raise his price whenever it suited him. The only thing that broke that model was collective resistance. We tried collective action with the barn raising, she said. 14 families. They came because it was concrete. One day, one barn, they could see exactly what they were committing to. This is harder. A lot harder, Silas said. Because they're frightened, and frightened people need to believe that acting is safer than not acting. She looked at him across the table. Right now, they don't believe that. Crow has been smart about keeping each ranch isolated. They don't know what's happening to their neighbors. So we tell them. We tell them, she said. And we propose something specific. Not just solidarity, an actual arrangement. Who watches whose land, how they signal trouble, what the response looks like. She had been thinking about this for days, working out the specifics in the notebook she kept beside the ledger. If Crow attacks one ranch and 3 others show up armed within an hour, he can't sustain that. His whole operation depends on the cost of enforcement staying low. Silas was quiet for a long moment. You've thought about this a lot. I've had 12 days with not much to do but manage crises and think, she said. That's not what most people would call not much to do. You know what I mean. He did. He looked at the table and then at the window and then back at her. Fordham, he said. If Fordham's in, the others will come. She had reached the same conclusion. Del Fordham was not the largest landholder in absolute terms. Silas held more acreage. But he had the longest history in the valley and the kind of trust that came from being known as someone who did not act rashly and whose word held. If Fordham stood up, other men who'd been waiting for someone else to move first would move. I can write to Fordham, she said, or you can talk to him directly. Probably better coming from you. I'll ride out there, Silas said. This week. She nodded. Take me. He looked at her. Fordham and I had a conversation at the social, she said. I don't think he's decided against me. I think he'd find it useful to see that you and I are operating together on this. Not that you've been convinced of something by your bookkeeper. A pause. You're not my bookkeeper, he said. I know that. He needs to know it too. Silas considered this for a moment, and then he said, Thursday. We'll ride out Thursday. They rode out Thursday. Fordham's property was larger and better maintained than the Kane Ranch, with the particular look of an operation that had been well funded for long enough that it had achieved a kind of solidity. The main house was 2 stories. The fences were in good repair. The hands Abigail saw as they rode in moved with the ease of people who weren't chronically overworked, which was its own form of information. Fordham met them in the yard. He looked at Silas and then at Abigail, and then back at Silas with an expression that was measuring without being unfriendly. Kane, he said. Miss Mercer. Dell, Silas said. We need to talk about Crow. They went inside. Fordham's wife brought coffee without being asked, and then left with the efficiency of someone who understood the nature of the conversation and had no desire to participate in it, which Abigail noted without comment. Silas laid out the situation directly. What had happened at the Kane Ranch, what had happened at Ellery's, what he understood of Crow's pattern and reach. Fordham listened without moving, his hands flat on the table, the way a man listens when he is taking something seriously. When Silas was done, Fordham said, And you want to organize a response? Yes, Silas said. What kind of response? Abigail spoke before Silas could. A watch arrangement, agreed signals between properties. Commitment that if one ranch is attacked, the others respond. She kept her voice level and her hands still. Not a militia. A neighborhood. Neighbors who've decided that isolation is the thing that's hurting them, and they're done with it. Fordham looked at her. How many ranches are we talking about? That depends on who commits, she said, but 8 to 10 within reasonable riding distance of each other could cover the valley. Crow has 6 to 8 men at most. If 8 ranches respond to an attack, his arithmetic stops working. He could retaliate against a single ranch hard before help arrives, Fordham said. He could. He'll try, probably, the first time. That's the cost of the first response, and everyone involved needs to understand it going in. She met his gaze. What's the cost of not responding? It's Ellery's calculation right now. If Ellery pays, Crow is established. He'll expand. Next year it won't be 8 ranches he's pressing, it'll be 20. A long silence. Fordham looked at the table. Then he looked at Silas. You're behind this. I am, Silas said. Both of you. Yes, Silas said. Fordham was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup. I didn't go to the barn raising, he said. I had reasons. They don't matter now? He drank. I'll talk to Pemberton and the Hardcastle brothers. That's 4 properties east of the ridge. You bring the valley ranches. Abigail exhaled, quietly, so neither man noticed. We'll need a meeting, she said, somewhere central. Here, Fordham said. 2 weeks. I'll send the word east if you send it west. She wrote 11 letters over the next 4 days. She wrote them differently than she had written the barn-raising letters. Those had been about a single concrete ask, a single day of work, come and go. These were about something permanent, and she wrote them accordingly. Clear about the risk, clear about what was required and what was not. Not asking anyone to be brave, because asking people to be brave was a way of making them feel that they weren't already, and these people were already. They just needed someone to organize the bravery into something that had a shape. 8 families confirmed. 3 did not respond, and she didn't push them, because people who weren't ready. And forcing an unwilling participant into a defensive arrangement was as bad as not having them. The meeting was on a Sunday afternoon held in Fordham's large main room with people standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. Abigail sat near the back, which was a deliberate choice. This needed to feel like a community decision, not something being done to the community by outsiders. And she was still, in some fundamental way, an outsider. She spoke twice, both times briefly, both times with the specific numbers and logistics she'd prepared. The rest of the time she watched. What she saw was a room full of people who were frightened and tired of being frightened and wanted something to do about it, but were not sure they trusted each other enough to act together. That was the real problem. Not courage, but trust. And trust was not something you could install in an afternoon. Silas spoke, and what he said surprised her somewhat. He did not make the case strategically, the way she had been making it. He talked about his father building the ranch, about 2 bad winters and the debt that resulted and the barn that had burned. He talked about standing in his yard with 12 days' worth of cattle drive ahead of him, knowing Crow's men would come while he was gone, and leaving anyway because the ranch had to survive, and that meant trusting something beyond his own 2 hands. She held it, he said. 2 men came to that ranch with a protection offer, and she turned them around in the yard, alone, with 4 hands and a shotgun she'd learned to use 2 weeks before. He was not looking at Abigail. He was looking at the room. I'm not telling you Crow isn't dangerous. He is. What I'm telling you is that sitting separate is the thing that makes him work. The moment we're not separate, he's got a different problem than he had before. The room was very quiet. Garrett Marsh said, "What's the signal? If a ranch needs help." "Fire," Abigail said from her place near the back. "Stack of green wood, something that smokes hard. You can see it from 2 miles in clear weather. At night, fire on the high ground." "And the response time we're committing to," Fordham said. "Within an hour for the nearest properties," she said. 2 for the ones on the outer edge. Everyone armed and with a clear head about what they're riding into. More silence. Then Ellery, who had come and had not spoken until now, said quietly, "I paid him last week. I want people to know that, because it's going to come out anyway." He looked at his hands. "I paid because my wife was scared and my children were there and I didn't see another way. And I'm here now because if this works, I'll stop paying. And if it doesn't work, at least I tried something." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Celia Marsh said simply, "That's honest." And the quality of the air in the room changed in a way that Abigail felt more than saw. By the time people left, 10 families had committed. The signal system was agreed on. The meeting intervals were set. It was not, she thought, riding home beside Silas in the late afternoon light, a finished thing. It was the beginning of a thing that would need tending and testing and would probably not hold perfectly when it was actually tested. But it existed, and existing was where everything started. You didn't say much, Silas said. I said what was needed, she said. He was quiet for a while. The road ran along a creek, and the evening light was turning the water gold, and the cottonwoods were moving in a slow wind. What Ellery said, Silas said, about paying. It was brave, she said, saying it in that room. Yes, he said, it was. Another silence. She thought he was going to leave it there. Silas had a way of completing a thought with silence rather than words. But then he said, I've been proud in bad ways sometimes, about the ranch, not asking for help when I should have. If the debt had gotten worse, I would have lost everything, and I probably would have said it was my own business and not wanted help even then. She looked at him. He was watching the road. You asked for help with the barn raising, she said. You made the case for it, he said. I just agreed. Agreeing when someone makes a good case is not nothing, she said. Most men I've known take longer to distinguish between pride and stubbornness. He glanced at her. Most men you've known. The ones worth observing, she said. He turned back to the road, and she saw the almost smile and said nothing further, and they rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet of two people who have run out of necessary words for the day and don't mind. Crow tested the arrangement 5 weeks later. He didn't test it against the Kane Ranch, which was what Abigail had half expected. He chose the Hardcastle brothers' property on the eastern side of the ridge, presumably because the Hardcastles were newer to the arrangement, and Crow's assessment was that a newer commitment was a weaker one. It was a Friday night in late July, and the first signal fire went up on the ridge above Hardcastle land at around 9 o'clock. Abigail saw it from the Kane property ahead. She had been sitting on the covered porch in the warm night because the day had been hot and the evening was finally bearable. And she stood and looked at it for perhaps 3 seconds and then went inside. Silas, she said. He was already on his feet. He must have seen it through the window. Within 15 minutes, he was riding with Duff and Pelletier, and Abigail was back on the porch watching the darkness and the distant signal fire and doing the arithmetic of who would arrive when and whether the response time they had committed to was actually achievable. She had not argued to go. This was combat, or something close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter, and she understood the difference between the things she was good at and the things she was not. What she did instead was go to the second-story window that gave the best view of the eastern ridge, and she sat there through most of the night with a candle and the ledger she'd stopped pretending to work on, and she waited. Silas came back at 2 in the morning. She heard the horses in the yard and came downstairs. He was tired and dirty, but not hurt. She checked for hurt before anything else, which she acknowledged was not her most dignified impulse, but was genuine and therefore not worth suppressing. Duff had a cut on his forearm that Rosaria, who had also been awake, dealt with before Abigail could ask about it. Tell me, she said. Silas poured water and drank half of it and set the glass down. Crow sent 4 men, Hardcastle's south barn, same as ours. They were planning to fire it. He looked at her. We got there before they finished setting it. Marsh and Fordham came in from the east about 10 minutes after us. Crow's men ran. Anyone hurt badly? No. Hardcastle took a graze on his shoulder. One of Fordham's men got thrown when his horse spooked, nothing broken. He paused. 2 of Crow's men we caught. The others got away. What happened to the 2 you caught? Fordham's holding them for the marshal. He sat down heavily. It worked, he said. The signal, the response, all of it. It actually worked the way you planned it. She looked at him. It worked this time, she said. Crow is still out there. I know. He'll adjust, she said. He'll try something different. I know that too. He looked up at her. But he had 4 men there tonight, and 8 men showed up against them. That changes something in the arithmetic he's been running. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the night outside and the distant movement of horses settling. She thought about Crow, the man she had never seen, whose name she had heard for weeks now, like a recurring weather forecast, and what it would mean to him to have 4 men captured or routed by a coordinated response, whether it would discourage him or simply make him angry, and what the difference would look like. He'll come harder, she said, or he'll come smarter. Either way, we need to be ready. Silas nodded. Then he said, Abigail. It was the first time he had used her first name without it being part of a longer sentence. She noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure. Yes, she said. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. When I left for the drive, he said, I told myself it was because the bank payment couldn't wait, which was true, but I also... He stopped. I had a feeling when I wrote out that I was leaving something that mattered, and I didn't have the right language for what it was. She held very still. I have the language now, he said, if you want to hear it. She thought about the day she'd arrived on this ranch, exhausted and scratched from the brush, talking about job offers and one-night shelters and the road to Whitmore's that she had never taken. She thought about the ledger that had turned into something that wasn't a ledger anymore. She thought about 12 days alone and signal fires and the almost smile and the way he'd said she held it to a room full of people. I want to hear it, she said. What he said was not long or particularly polished, because Silas Kane did not deal in long or polished. He said that he was not easy to be around, that he understood this and wasn't under any illusions about it. He said that the ranch had been a lonely operation for years, and he hadn't questioned that until she arrived and made the loneliness visible by contrast. He said he was aware that she was capable of leaving, that she had options, that nothing was holding her except her own decision, and that he would rather know now if the decision was uncertain than find out later when it would cost more. He was looking at the table when he said most of it, and at her at the end. It's not uncertain, she said. No? No, she said. It hasn't been uncertain for a while, if I'm being accurate. He was quiet for a moment. Since when? She thought about it. Since the barn raising, she said. When you told that room that she held it. I think that was when I understood what kind of man you were, and that I had... She stopped, because the word she was reaching for was large and she wanted to use it correctly. That I had made a decision without quite deciding. He looked at her steadily. And is that a comfortable position? Not particularly, she said, but I've been in uncomfortable positions since March and I seem to be managing. He made the real laugh, not the almost, the actual one, which she had heard only twice before and which she hoped to hear considerably more often. It was brief and genuine, and it changed his face in a way that made him look younger than he was. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not as whatever it is you've been, something else. Something else, she said. Permanently, he said. She looked at him. He was serious. He was always serious, but this was a particular gravity, the kind that accompanied the things he was most certain of. She thought about $32 and a letter that had turned out to be a lie and a game trail in a Wyoming forest, and all the distance between that moment and this kitchen table in July. Yes, she said. I'd like that. He nodded once, as if the matter were decided, which it was. Then he looked at his hands and then at her and said, I should probably ask properly, at some point. You have time, she said. Not too much. No, she agreed. Not too much. Rosaria appeared in the kitchen doorway with a complete absence of expression that indicated she had heard everything and was exercising considerable personal discipline. She set a plate of food on the table in front of Silas, refilled both coffee cups, and retreated without comment. Abigail caught her eye as she turned. Rosaria's face remained entirely neutral, but she moved back to the door with what could only be described, in someone with less habitual composure, as satisfaction. She asked Silas, 2 days later, about Harlow. She had been wondering about it since the night he'd named him across the burned-out coals of the barn, and she had waited because she'd understood it as a matter he intended to handle himself, and that her role in it was to provide the evidence, not the outcome. But enough weeks had passed and enough things had changed that she felt entitled to know. They were at the kitchen table in the evening when she asked. He looked up from the feed report he was reading. What happened with Harlow? She said. A pause. I went to Cheyenne in May, he said, before you were here for the drive. And? He was running a freighting operation out of a warehouse near the rail yard. He folded the feed report and set it on the table. I went to see him, told him what I knew and what I had documents to prove, and that the territorial judge in Cheyenne was acquainted with my family. Is that true? My father knew him, Silas said. Whether the acquaintance still means anything, I don't know. But Harlow didn't know whether it was true or not. What did he agree to? To repay what he'd taken. Monthly installments. He was watching the table. It's not a perfect resolution. No, she said, but it's a practical one. He's connected to Crow, Silas said. The fraud in the accounts, the 3 men on the trail, Harlow pointed them at you when he found out someone was coming to do the books. He thought if you didn't make it to the ranch, no one would look at his numbers. She took that in. She had suspected it. Had suspected it since the day Silas said the name over the barn's coals. But having it confirmed made something cold move through her that she let herself feel for a moment before setting aside. So Crow knew about the ranch before the barn burning, she said. Yes. Harlow had been feeding him information. Silas's operation is in trouble. Here's the debt situation. Here's the staffing. Here's when the cattle drive goes out. He looked at her. They were more coordinated than I realized. Then getting the repayment from Harlow was also cutting Crow's information source, she said. That was part of the thinking. She nodded slowly. You should have told me sooner. I know, he said. I wasn't sure how to explain that the trouble you landed in on the road was partly my trouble that had extended its range. It doesn't matter whose trouble it started as, she said. What matters is that we're dealing with it. She looked at him. Don't do that again. The not telling. No, he said. I can't help with things I don't know about. I understand that, he said, and then, I'm not used to having someone to tell things to. It was simply said, without self-pity or apology. She looked at him and understood that it was a more significant admission from Silas Kane than almost anything else he could have said. You do now, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, he said, I do. Outside, the July night was pressing warm and still against the windows, and somewhere out on the range an owl was conducting its own business in the dark. The ranch held its shape around them. The new barn, the mended fence, the north herd with its restored water, the arrangement of 10 families that had proven, one Friday night on the eastern ridge, that it worked when it needed to. Not perfectly, not without cost, but it had held. Abigail Mercer, who had come to Wyoming with $32 and a shattered plan and no idea at all what she was walking into, sat across a kitchen table from the man who had ridden down a ridge at full speed to pull her out of a draw, and thought that the world had a stranger and more specific sense of logic to it than she had previously credited. She did not say this out loud. It was the kind of thought you kept close. But she thought it. He asked her properly on a Thursday morning in August, which was not, by any conventional measure, a romantic occasion. They were fixing the water trough in the south paddock, which had developed a split along the base seam that was losing several gallons a day, and Silas had one end of it lifted while Abigail worked the patching compound into the crack with a wooden tool Wierzbicki had shaped for exactly this kind of repair. Her hands were dirty. Her hair had come loose on one side. The sun was already hot at 9 in the morning in the particular aggressive way of Wyoming August, and she was thinking about the afternoon accounts and whether Pelletier's wages needed to be renegotiated before he started looking at other options the way Crane and Mitchell had. Silas set his end of the trough down, which she registered peripherally, and then he said her name. She looked up. He was standing with his hands at his sides in the manner of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it before he can talk himself out of it. He did not drop to a knee. That was not who he was, and she would not have believed it from him. I said I'd ask properly, he said. This is properly. Will you marry me? She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, with the particular directness that was characteristic of every significant thing he had ever said to her. No ornament, no hedging, just the question and the waiting. She thought about the right answer for approximately 3 seconds. Yes, she said. Now help me get this seam sealed before the compound sets. He crouched down and took the other side of the trough, and they finished the repair together, and he did not say anything further about the proposal, and neither did she, because the agreement had been made and all the rest was logistics, and they were both, fundamentally, people who understood that logistics were important and worth attending to. Rosaria found out at dinner. She had a way of extracting information not by asking for it, but by waiting with the specific patience of someone who already suspects and is simply allowing the moment to complete itself. Silas told her during a silence between dishes, with no more ceremony than he used to relay ranch information, and Rosaria looked at him and then at Abigail and then set a plate down with a precision that communicated, if you knew how to read her, something very close to joy. "About time," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Duff, who was eating at the other end of the table and had heard everything, looked at his plate with the studied concentration of someone working hard at appearing to have heard nothing. "Congratulations," he said to the plate. "Thank you, Duff," Abigail said. "Yes, sir," he said, still to the plate. The next morning she wrote 2 letters. One to her cousin Margaret in Charlestown, whom she had not corresponded with since March and who would need to know. Margaret's reply, which arrived 3 weeks later, was warm and a little bewildered. Wyoming, Abigail, of all the places you might have ended up, and contained a small package with a piece of lace from their grandmother's collection, which she did not expect and which affected her more than she thought it would. The second letter was harder to write, and she went through 4 drafts before settling on a version she was satisfied with. It was to Del Fordham, informing him of the engagement before it became general knowledge by other means. She did it partly out of courtesy. Fordham was now one of the principal members of the Valley Alliance and deserved to hear significant news from the Kane Ranch directly rather than as gossip. And partly because she had come to understand that Fordham's opinion carried weight she didn't want to lose. His reply came within the week, which was fast for a man who was not generally quick to commit himself. It was brief. He wished them well, noted that Silas had needed someone with a practical head beside him for some years, and would be at the wedding if invited. The last line made her smile, because it was almost a compliment, and Del Fordham didn't hand those out carelessly. The town's opinion was more complicated. Caldwell's Crossing had, by August, moved through several positions on Abigail Mercer in the months since she'd arrived. The initial suspicion, what is she doing there? What does she want? Who is she really? Had been eroded by the barn raising, and then by the news about the Harlow situation, and then by the alliance meeting at Fordham's property, the account of which had spread through the valley with the efficiency that small communities apply to genuinely interesting information. People had revised their view of her, some significantly, some partially, some not at all. The engagement produced a new round of opinion. Some of it was genuinely warm. Celia Marsh sent a note the day she heard, apparently within hours of the information reaching the Marsh property, which confirmed Abigail's assessment that the Valley's information network was faster than the telegraph when it was motivated. The note was brief and affectionate and ended with, "I told you to come to the social. You're welcome." Some of the opinion was less warm, and Abigail heard it through the usual indirect channels. The storekeeper's wife, who mentioned that certain people felt the match was convenient, meaning convenient for Abigail, meaning they still carried the original suspicion about her motives despite everything. She spent a day and a half being more irritated about this than she intended to, and then made herself stop, partly because irritation was unproductive, and partly because she had come to understand something about small communities that Boston had never required her to learn. You did not win everyone, and trying to was a way of making yourself smaller and more anxious without actually changing anyone's mind. The people who had decided who she was had decided, and the people who were still deciding would decide based on what they observed over time, and that was all she had control over. She said this to Silas one evening, and he listened and then said, "Half those people thought I was going to lose the ranch last winter, same ones. Does that bother you?" "Did once," he said. "Less now." He looked at her across the table. You change a few things around you, you start to care less what people thought before the change. It was true enough that she thought about it for the rest of the evening. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, which gave the summer's remaining work time to be completed and the weather enough time to be statistically cooperative. Abigail organized it the way she organized everything, methodically, without excessive romanticism about the details, focused on the things that actually mattered. A civil ceremony, because the nearest minister was in Cheyenne, and she saw no reason to make people travel for what was fundamentally a legal and personal arrangement. A gathering at the ranch afterward, enough food for everyone who came, and enough space in the yard that people who found each other disagreeable could maintain comfortable distances. Celia Marsh took one look at Abigail's approach to planning the gathering and appointed herself coordinator, which Abigail accepted without argument because Celia understood the social geography of the valley in ways that would have taken Abigail 3 more years to learn, and there was no practical reason to pretend otherwise. "You're not going to fight me on the decorating," Celia said. It was not a question. "No," Abigail said, "but nothing expensive." "Obviously nothing expensive," Celia said, in the tone of someone pointing out that water is wet. "We're not in Denver." They were not in Denver. The decorations were pine boughs and dried wildflowers, and the particular aesthetic of people who know how to make the most of what is at hand, which was, Abigail thought, an appropriate aesthetic for the occasion. Silas submitted to the process with what she recognized as genuine effort. He was not a man for whom ceremony came naturally. He existed in the world of things that needed doing, and ceremony was, fundamentally, a thing that needed doing rather than a thing that produced direct results, and that required a different kind of patience from him. But he submitted. He let Rosaria talk him into a new coat, which he wore with the expression of a man wearing a new coat who would rather not be. He agreed to the gathering without suggesting they simplify it to a brief legal proceeding, which she appreciated because she suspected that was his preference, and he was managing it for her sake. She told him this the night before. They were on the covered porch in the cooling October evening, both of them nominally looking at the dark range beyond the yard, actually looking at the fact of the next day and what it meant. "You don't have to pretend to want the gathering," she said. "I know it's not your natural preference." He was quiet for a moment. "I want the part that means you're staying permanently," he said. "The gathering is attached to that part, so I want the gathering." She looked at him. "It's not complicated," he said. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." The morning of the wedding was cold and clear, the kind of October morning Wyoming produced when it was in a benevolent mood, which was not always. The mountains to the north were snow-capped, and the air had that particular clarity that came with the first real cold, the kind that made distances look smaller and colors sharper. People began arriving in the mid-morning, more than she expected. The confirmed count she'd been working from was 38 people, and she counted closer to 50 by the time the ceremony began, which meant either her information network had been incomplete or the information about the wedding had spread further than she'd tracked. She decided not to be irritated about the logistics of feeding unanticipated guests, partly because Celia had anticipated it and prepared accordingly, and partly because the reason more people had come than expected was not cruelty or nosiness, but something she hadn't quite accounted for. People were interested, not gossip interested. Interested the way communities are interested when something is happening that changes the shape of things, and they want to be present for it. The ceremony itself was brief. The justice of the peace from Caldwell's Crossing was a small, efficient man named Burgess, who performed weddings with the professional competence of someone who had done many and understood that the people involved were not primarily interested in his contribution. He asked the necessary questions. They gave the necessary answers. Silas put a ring on her finger that she had not seen before that moment. A plain gold band that had apparently been his mother's, which Rosaria had produced from wherever it had been kept, and which fit, imperfectly, but closely enough. She did not cry. She had not expected to cry, and she did not. What she felt was quieter than tears, a settling, like ground-taking weight, the sense of something that had been provisional becoming permanent. Silas looked at her during the ceremony with an expression she had come to know, that complete, serious attention that he gave to things that mattered to him. It was not a romantic expression in the conventional sense. It was better than that. It was the look of a man who intended to keep his word. Afterward, the yard filled with people and sound, and the smell of food and the particular energy of a community occasion in a place where such occasions were not frequent enough to be taken lightly. Del Fordham arrived, which she registered with satisfaction. The Hardcastle brothers came, and Ellery with his wife, who had recovered from her earlier frightened state into something harder and more resolved, which Abigail thought well of. The Marsh family came en masse, including 3 children who immediately disappeared into the general population of children and created a background chaos that was, she thought, exactly the right kind of noise for the day. Silas stood in his new coat and talked to people, which he did with more ease than she might have expected. He was not a social creature, but he understood the transaction of it, the specific respect required, the questions worth asking, the acknowledgments that mattered. And he moved through the gathering with a quiet competence that was not warmth exactly, but was its functional equivalent. She watched him talking with Fordham near the fence line, 2 men who had lived in the same valley for decades, and negotiated the distance between their properties with the careful respect of people who understood that good neighbors required maintenance. Whatever they were saying, it was serious. Both of them had that stillness that came with a conversation that meant something. She didn't go over. Some conversations needed their own space. Celia found her near the food table. "Well," Celia said. "Well," Abigail agreed. "You look like yourself," Celia said. "I mean that as a compliment. Some women look like something else on their wedding days. You look exactly like yourself." "Is that unusual?" "More than you'd think," Celia said. She picked up a piece of food and ate it and looked out over the gathering. "He's going to be difficult sometimes," she said. "Silas, stubborn and closed off and impossible to read." "I know that," Abigail said. "And you're going to be—" Celia paused, apparently selecting her words. "A lot, for a man who's used to quiet." "I know that too." "Good," Celia said. "At least you're going in honest." She smiled, which was a rare enough expression on her to be noticeable. "You'll be all right." It was not the most effusive wedding blessing she could have received. It was, coming from Celia Marsh, quite a lot. The afternoon wore on, and people drifted away in the gradual way of a gathering that has completed its purpose but doesn't want to acknowledge it too quickly. By the time the light was dropping behind the western ridge, the yard had thinned to the people who lived closest and had lingered, and Rosaria was organizing what remained of the food with the efficient finality of a woman closing an operation. Duff, who had consumed an injudicious amount of the cider that the Hardcastle brothers had contributed, was sitting on the fence and being unreliably philosophical. "The thing about this valley," he was telling Pelletier, who was listening with the resigned patience of someone who has decided the fastest path through a conversation is to let it run, "is that it looks like nothing from outside. Looks like just land, but there's actually a whole thing happening here, like a machinery." "Go to bed, Duff," Abigail said, passing by. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and stayed on the fence. Silas found her on the covered porch when the last of the guests had gone, and the yard was quiet, and the evening had settled into the particular stillness of a Wyoming night going cold. He came and stood beside her and looked out at the dark, and she leaned against him. Not dramatically, just shifted her weight. And he put his arm around her in the matter-of-fact way that she was already understanding was how he expressed things that other people required more elaborate language for. They stood there for a while without talking. Then she said, "The news from the Hardcastle brothers." He was quiet for a moment. He told her on the morning of the wedding, when perhaps the timing wasn't ideal, but the information was too significant to hold. Crow had moved. He'd pulled his operation north, apparently in response to the failed raid in July, and there were reports from Shoshone County of the same pattern starting up there: pressure on isolated ranches, protection demands, violence when refused. "He'll be back," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "Or he'll send someone," which amounts to the same thing. "The Alliance held the valley through the summer." "It did," she said. "But Crow's adapting. He went north because we became too expensive here. When he's stabilized something up there, he'll look south again because we were profitable before the Alliance, and he'll want to know if that's changed." "What are you thinking?" he said. It was the question he asked when he could tell she was already several steps into a plan, which she had noticed was a frequent condition and which he had apparently made peace with. "The Alliance needs to extend north," she said. "Not just the valley. If Crow is working Shoshone County, those ranchers are facing exactly what we faced 6 months ago. And they don't have an organization." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "That's a bigger reach than the valley." "I know. More people, more variables, harder to coordinate." "Yes," she said. "And if we don't, Crow builds something solid up there and comes back at us from a position we can't match." He stood beside her in the dark, thinking about it. She could feel the quality of his attention, the specific weight of it, the way she had come to feel the difference between him processing something and him having already decided. "Fordham," he said. "Fordham would need to be involved," she agreed, "and probably someone from Shoshone County with standing there. I don't know those communities the way I know this one. I might know a man," Silas said slowly. "Up in Shoshone. Feller named Aldous. He ran a cooperative grazing arrangement up there for a few years. Got the neighbors to share a bull and split the cost of all things, and made it work. If he's still there and still got standing. Can you find out?" "Send a letter," he said, "or write up in a couple weeks." She turned and looked at him. He was watching the dark range with that particular expression, forward-facing, calculating the next necessary thing. It was, she thought, both a quality she valued in him and, occasionally, a slight impediment to other kinds of attention. But this was not the moment to make that observation. "Not for a couple of weeks," she said. He looked at her. "No? We've been working toward this day for 7 months," she said. "For the next 2 weeks, the North can handle itself." He held her gaze. Then something in his face did the thing she liked, shifted, became less managed, more present. "All right," he said. 2 weeks. And Duff can handle the morning schedule. Duff is currently falling off a fence. He'll be fine by morning," she said. They were both quiet for a moment, listening to the dark. From somewhere near the fence there was a thud and a muffled noise that was probably Duff not being fine quite yet. They chose not to investigate. "Silas," she said. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as a statement and not as a question, because it isn't a question." He waited. "I am exactly where I intend to be," she said. "Not because I had nowhere else to go. Not because circumstance arranged itself around me. Because I made a choice, and I would make it again, and I want you to know that because you are the kind of man who worries about things like that without saying so." He was very still for a moment. "I do worry about that," he said. "I know," she said. "Stop." He exhaled, a breath that carried more weight than its size suggested. Then he pulled her slightly closer, which for Silas Kane was a declaration. They stood there until the cold made staying impractical, and went inside where Rosaria had left a lamp burning, and the kitchen was warm and the ledger was on the table because some things were permanent regardless of the occasion. She sat down and opened it out of pure habit, looked at what she'd last recorded, and closed it again. Tomorrow, there would be work. Tomorrow there would be Crow to think about, and Shoshone County, and the Alliance, and the accounts, and the fence in the north pasture that was developing the same problem the east fence had in the spring. Tomorrow. Tonight she sat in the kitchen of a ranch that had been failing when she arrived and was not failing anymore. In a valley that had been isolated when she arrived and was not isolated anymore. Across from a man who had been alone in a way he hadn't understood until she showed up and made the loneliness visible by contrast. She thought about a letter in the Boston Courier, about $32 and a leather satchel and a game trail in a Wyoming forest. The world had a stranger and more specific sense of logic to it than she had previously credited. She had thought this before and she still believed it, and sitting in this kitchen on this particular night she felt it as something more than a thought. Felt it the way you feel the ground under your feet, that fundamental assurance that there is something solid and real beneath the uncertainty of everything else. She reached for the coffee Rosaria had left. It was still warm. Outside, Wyoming was conducting its usual dark business, indifferent and beautiful and entirely without sentiment. And inside the lamp burned, and the ranch held its shape around them, and Abigail Kane, the name was still new, she was still learning its weight, sat in her kitchen and let the day close behind her. The letter from Shoshone County arrived in November, 3 weeks after Silas had ridden north to find the man named Aldous. He had come back from that trip quieter than usual, which was saying something, and she had given him 2 days before asking. What he told her was that the situation north of the valley was worse than the reports had suggested. Crow had not simply moved his operation, he had expanded it, taking on additional men and running a more organized version of the same pressure arrangement, but with a refinement that showed he had learned something from the July failure at Harcastle's. He was no longer attacking properties directly. He was intercepting supply lines, spoiling relationships with vendors, sending men to the stockyards to make quiet arrangements that meant certain ranchers found their cattle graded lower or buyers mysteriously unavailable. It was slower than burning barns and harder to prove, and in some ways more effective. Aldous, whose full name was Aldous Crane, no relation to the Crane who had left the Kane Ranch for his brother's freighting operation, was a barrel-shaped man in his 60s who had spent 40 years in Shoshone County and had the particular credibility of someone who had seen everything the territory could produce and was still standing. Silas had described him as a man who chose his words like ammunition, not many, but placed with precision. Aldous had agreed to coordinate the northern ranches. The letter confirmed it in his handwriting, which was large and deliberate, and laid out which properties were in and what the proposed signal arrangement would look like given the different geography north of the ridge. He also included, at the end, a single paragraph about Crow that contained more specific intelligence than anything they had gathered through the summer. She read this paragraph twice. He has a buyer, she told Silas. For cattle. Someone in the rail yards at Rawlins who processes stolen stock through a shell of a legitimate buying operation. That's why he can keep moving. He has a guaranteed revenue stream that doesn't depend on the protection money. Silas read the paragraph himself. Aldous got this how? His nephew works the rail yard, she said. Not for Crow. For the legitimate rail operation. But he's seen the same buyer making unusual volumes of purchases with no clear source ranches attached. That's not proof. No, she said, but it's the right direction to look. She set the letter down. If we take away the buyer, Crow's stolen cattle become a liability instead of an asset. He can't move them. He can't fund his operation. The protection money alone doesn't sustain what he's running. Silas looked at her. You're talking about going to the territorial marshal. I'm talking about going with something specific enough that the marshal can't ignore it, she said. Not a complaint about intimidation. They've had those and done nothing. Evidence of a criminal receiving operation at a named location in Rawlins with specific transaction patterns. She looked at the letter. Aldous' nephew can document the buyer. I can document the timeline of stolen cattle from Valley ranches against the buyer's purchase records if we can get access to them. How do we get access to rail yard purchase records? We asked the territorial marshal to subpoena them, she said, which he will do if we give him enough to justify it. And I can write that justification. He was quiet for a moment, doing the calculation she had learned to recognize. Not doubt, exactly, but the honest assessment of what was difficult and what was possible, and where the line between them sat. It'll take time, he said. Yes, she said. And Crow will keep operating while it takes time. But it's the thing that actually ends it. Not another defensive action. Those buy us months. This could buy us permanent. He looked at her across the table. Write it, he said. She wrote it. It took 4 days, which was longer than most things took her, because the document needed to be precise in a specific way, compelling enough to move a territorial marshal who had limited resources and several counties of problems competing for his attention, but based entirely on what they could actually demonstrate rather than what they suspected. She went through it with Silas every evening, checking the logic, testing the weaknesses, revising the sections where she had let the argument outrun the evidence. On the 5th day, she sent it by courier to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne. She also sent a copy to a lawyer in Cheyenne whose name Fordham had provided, a woman named Hartley who handled land and criminal matters, and had, according to Fordham, a reputation for taking cases that had factual merit, regardless of whether they also had money behind them. Then she waited, which was the part she was worst at. December came in cold and the ranch contracted into its winter operations, which were less varied than spring and summer but not less demanding. Animals needed more attention in cold. Equipment needed more maintenance. The feed calculations required constant revision against actual consumption. She threw herself into the winter accounts with the particular energy of someone who needs a container for their impatience. And Silas watched this with the expression he had developed for her various intensities, which was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. You're going to have those numbers memorized by February, he said one evening. I already have them memorized, she said. I'm looking for where they're wrong. Are they wrong? Something in the feed calculation for the North herd is off by about 8%, and I can't find where. She looked up. It'll bother me until I do. It'll bother you until spring, he said, at which point the actual consumption will tell you. I don't want to wait until spring. I know, he said. He picked up his coffee. The marshal hasn't written. I know that too. It's been 3 weeks. I know, she said, and heard the sharpness in her own voice and moderated it. I know. These things take time. I wrote a document, not a warrant. There are steps between the document and anything happening. Yes, he said. There are. He set his coffee down. You did what you could do. The rest is someone else's part. She looked at him. It was, she thought, the most useful thing anyone had said to her in 3 weeks, partly because it was true, and partly because she needed to hear it from outside her own head, where it had been circulating without sticking. You're right, she said. Occasionally, he said. She found the error in the feed calculation 2 days later. It was a transcription mistake from September, a single digit transposed in a way that had been compounding forward through 3 months of calculations. She fixed it, noted the correction, and felt the small, clean satisfaction of a problem properly resolved, which was different from the large, complicated satisfaction of problems that required other people to resolve them and simply had to be waited for. The marshal's letter arrived in January. It was not long. The territorial marshal, a man named Coates, whose signature was large and leaned forward like a man in a hurry, wrote that the document she had submitted had been reviewed, that the specific information regarding the Rawlins buyer had been forwarded to the appropriate federal authority given its potential interstate dimensions, and that an investigation was underway. He could not share details of an ongoing investigation. He thanked her for the thoroughness of the submission and noted in a sentence she read 3 times that it was among the more professionally constructed evidentiary summaries he had received from a non-legal source. She showed it to Silas. He read it and set it down. Federal, he said. If the buying operation crosses state lines, which it probably does given the volume Aldous' nephew described, it becomes a federal matter, she said, which is actually better for us. Federal resources are larger than territorial. And slower. Sometimes, she said, but they close things more completely when they close them. He nodded slowly. He did not say what she knew he was thinking, which was that an investigation could take months and Crow was not going to stop operating while it proceeded, and that the gap between starting a process and completing it was a space that needed to be survived. She knew it. She was thinking it too. February was hard in the particular way that the middle of Wyoming winters were hard. Not dramatically, not with the violence of the early cold or the collapse of the late season into mud, but with a grinding, gray, sustained difficulty that wore at the edges of everything. 2 of the North herd developed a respiratory illness that required twice-daily treatment for 3 weeks. A section of the new barn roof, the roof they had built in the spring, the roof whose completion had felt like a marker, developed a leak that turned out to require more than patching, and Silas spent 4 days in February cold, making a repair that should have been 2, and left him with a cough that persisted into March, and that she monitored with more concern than she expressed. "It's a cough," he said when she mentioned it. "It's been 6 weeks," she said. "I've had coughs longer than 6 weeks." "When?" He thought about it. "Can't recall specifically." "Then it might not have happened," she said. He gave her the look he had developed for when her logic was technically sound and practically irritating. "I'll see Alderman in town," he said. Alderman was the closest thing Caldwell's Crossing had to a doctor, a retired Army medic who had settled there 12 years ago and who handled most of the valley's medical needs with a pragmatic competence that Abigail respected. He went to see Alderman and came back with a bottle of something that smelled terrible and instructions to drink less coffee in the cold months, which he ignored except for the something, which worked well enough that the cough was mostly gone by April. April also brought the news from Rawlins. It came not from the marshal this time, but from lawyer Hartley, who had apparently been tracking the federal investigation through channels available to her, and who wrote a crisp, detailed letter that Abigail read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Silas was in the barn. The Rawlins buyer, a man named Petch, operating under a business name that sounded legitimate and wasn't, had been arrested in March. His records, subpoenaed in February, had produced evidence connecting him to the receipt of stolen cattle from no fewer than 11 ranches across 2 territories over a period of 14 months. Several of those transactions were directly traceable to Crow's operation. Federal warrants had been issued for Crow and 4 named associates. The territorial marshals in both Shoshone and Carbon counties had been coordinating on the arrest effort. She sat with this letter for a moment. Then she got up and went to the barn. Silas was working with Wierzbicki on a piece of equipment that had been misfiring since February. He looked up when she came in and read her face before she said anything. She had noticed he was getting better at that, or perhaps she was getting less guarded, which amounted to the same thing from the outside. "What?" he said. She told him. He listened without speaking. Then he looked at Wierzbicki, who had also listened and who was standing with the particular stillness of a man receiving important news. "They have Petch," Silas said. "And his records," she said. "And warrants for Crow." "Warrants aren't Crow." "No," she said. "But he's been operating in the open because he believed he was protected by complexity. Too many moving parts, too many counties, no single authority with the whole picture. Petch's records gave one authority the whole picture." Silas looked at the equipment, then at the barn wall, then at her. "He'll run," he said. "Probably," she said, "or he'll try to do something before he runs." That was the part she had been sitting with since reading the letter. A man like Crow, facing the collapse of his operation, with warrants out and his revenue stream cut and his organization starting to fracture. What did he do? He might run, yes, that was the rational calculation. But she had come to understand over the past year that Crow's particular psychology was not entirely rational. The failed July raid had not discouraged him. It had moved him. The evidence suggested a man who responded to setbacks with escalation rather than retreat, who needed to believe he was not beaten even when the arithmetic said otherwise. She sent word to Aldous. She sent word to Fordham. She did not write it as an alarm because she didn't know it was an alarm, but she wanted both men alert. Fordham came to the ranch 2 days later, which told her the message had landed the way she'd intended. They met in the kitchen, Silas, Abigail, Fordham, and talked about what a man in Crow's position might do. Fordham was, as always, specific. He had more information than she did. Through a contact in Shoshone County, he had heard that 3 of Crow's men had already separated from the main group, which in his view meant either the organization was dissolving or Crow was consolidating a smaller, more committed core for something specific. "Something specific," Silas said. "That's what I'd worry about," Fordham said. "A man who's lost everything and knows it, with a few people who are loyal enough to stay." He looked at the table. "That's not a man who runs quietly." "No," she said. They agreed on heightened watches across the Alliance properties. They agreed on a faster signal protocol, not the Greenwood fire which took time to prepare, but a series of gunshots in a specific pattern that could be produced immediately and heard over a longer distance than she had initially credited when she'd been calculating the original system. She did not sleep well for the next week. Neither did Silas, though he would not have said so. She knew because she knew the quality of his stillness in the dark, and the stillness of a man who is awake thinking is categorically different from the stillness of a man who is asleep. "You should rest," she said on the 4th night. "So should you," he said. "I was asleep until a few minutes ago." "Liar," he said, but without heat. She moved closer to him in the dark. "If he comes," she said, "we're not alone this time. That's different from last summer." "I know," he said. "The Alliance worked. 3 signals fired and 8 properties responded within the hour." "I know that too," he said. I'm not afraid of him exactly. I'm afraid of making an error, missing something." She understood this. It was the particular fear of someone who had spent a long time being responsible for things. Not fear of the danger itself, but fear of the failure of attention, the missed signal, the thing that seemed small until it wasn't. "You won't," she said. "You can't know that." "No," she said, "but I know you, and that's close enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and they both lay in the dark, not sleeping but doing something that was at least adjacent to rest, which was the best available option. Crow came on a Thursday night in late April, with 4 men and a focus that told her Fordham had been right. This was not a raid. This was a settlement. They came to the Kane Ranch specifically. She heard the horses in the yard at close to midnight and was out of bed before the sound had fully formed, the way she had learned to wake since the summer shots, not gradually, but all at once, already thinking. She heard Silas beside her do the same. The shots came from the yard, 2 of the agreed signal pattern, fired by Pelletier, who had the night watch. Abigail was dressed and had the shotgun by the time Silas was at the window. 4 horses that I can see, he said. Pelletier's behind the water trough. They don't know where he is. How long, she said. If the nearest properties heard the signal. He paused. 20 minutes. Maybe 30. We have to hold the yard for 30 minutes, she said. Yes, he said. He looked at her. You stay inside. I'll stay at the window, she said. Upstairs window gives a sight line across the whole yard. If anyone moves to the barn, I can see it before you can from the ground. He started to say something and stopped, because she was right, and they both knew it, and there was no time. If something happens, he said. Nothing's going to happen, she said. Go. What followed was not what she would later describe as a battle, though it had the elements of one. It was 23 minutes, she counted against the clock on the bedroom mantel, watching the yard through the window. of men positioned in the dark trying to determine where the resistance was coming from and whether it was worth pressing forward against. Crow had come expecting a sleeping ranch with minimal hands. He had found Pelletier awake and positioned. Silas coming out the back of the house to the stable side, Wierzbicki emerging from the bunkhouse with a rifle and the calm of a man who had seen worse. She saw Crow herself once. He was on horseback at the far edge of the yard, directing the others, and she recognized him not from description, but from the quality of his authority. The way the other men watched him for instruction, even when everything was going badly. He was not what she had imagined. He was ordinary-looking, middle-aged, wearing a coat that had been good once. He looked less like a criminal architect than a man who had made one kind of choice over a long time until it had become the only kind he knew. She did not fire at him. She was covering the barn, and he was not near the barn, and she understood the importance of doing the specific thing she was there to do rather than the dramatic thing. The first of the Alliance riders came in from the north at the 21-minute mark. She saw them before the men in the yard did. 4 riders coming fast down the road with the purposeful energy of people who had been waiting to be needed. Then 3 more from the east, then Fordham's distinctive gray horse, and 2 riders behind him. Crow saw them too. She watched him make the calculation from 40 yards away, and she watched the moment when the calculation resolved. He had come for a settlement and instead had found the exact situation that had beaten him last summer, scaled larger. He turned his horse. 2 of his men ran. The other 2, the most loyal, she supposed, or the least rational, held for perhaps 30 seconds longer before the arithmetic of 8 armed riders bearing down became undeniable. They were taken without further shots fired. Crow was found the following morning 12 miles north, where his horse had thrown him at a creek crossing in the dark and left him with a broken arm and no particular options. The Shoshone County Marshal's deputy collected him there, and that was the least dramatic ending she could have imagined for a man who had occupied so much of her thinking for nearly a year. She sat on the covered porch in the April morning and thought about that, about how the endings of things rarely matched the scale of the living through them. The barn had burned in an orange blaze that she would remember for the rest of her life. Crow was collected from a creek bank with a broken arm, his operation dissolved, his buyer in federal custody, his men either arrested or scattered. It didn't feel commensurate, but then most things didn't, and that was probably not the point. Silas came and sat beside her with coffee. His shoulder had taken a graze at some point in the night. She had dressed it herself at 2 in the morning and had managed, through considerable personal effort, to do it without expressing everything she felt about it. "Fordham's leaving," he said. "I know. I'll say goodbye." She looked at the yard, still marked with the evidence of the night. "Pelletier deserves a raise." "I know," he said. "And Wierzbicki." "I know that too." She looked at him. His face was tired in the deep way that went beyond one missed night. The fatigue of a long year, of sustained vigilance, of a kind of tension that didn't release all at once but would take weeks to gradually unwind. "It's over," she said. "Crow's over," he said. "Something else will come along eventually." "Yes," she said, "but we'll handle it." She looked out at the range, at the morning coming in gold over the eastern hills. "That's the thing I've learned here. It's not that the problems stop. It's that you build something solid enough that problems become problems instead of catastrophes." He was quiet for a moment. "When I found you in that draw," he said, "I thought you were a problem. You've said that before." "It keeps being true in new ways," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the range with the half-smile that was not quite a smile, and she thought about the game trail and the shotgun and the letters and the signal fires and Fordham's gray horse coming out of the dark at the 21-minute mark. And she thought about $32 and a lie printed on good stationery, and about how the worst thing that had ever happened to her had been the mechanism that brought her to the best thing. She did not believe that suffering was designed to produce outcomes. She did not believe the universe arranged itself for anyone's benefit. What she believed, and had come to believe here, in this specific place, through specific and often painful experience, was that people were more capable than they knew, and that the knowledge of that capability could only come from actually being tested, and that the testing was brutal and real and not made less brutal by whatever came after. She had crossed half a continent following a letter that turned out to be a lie. She had arrived with nothing and no one and no plan beyond surviving the week. She had built something, Not from nothing exactly, because she had always had the skills and the stubbornness that formed the foundation of everything that followed, but from the application of those things to real and specific circumstances that required her full self in a way that nothing in Boston ever had. That was the thing she would have told herself, if she could have reached back to the woman sitting in a Cheyenne telegraph office, holding a postal clerk's message and understanding she had been an idiot. Not that it would be fine, because she couldn't have known that. Not that everything happened for a reason, because she had never believed that. And the subsequent year had not changed her mind. She would have said, "You have more to work with than you think. Don't go home." She had not gone home. She had built one instead. The years that followed were not easy. She had lived in Wyoming long enough to understand that easy was not a category the territory dealt in, but they were good in the specific, durable way that things are good when they have been honestly earned. The ranch recovered its financial footing by the following spring, solidly enough that Silas paid the last of the debt to the Territorial Trust Company in a single payment in July, and came home from Cheyenne with the look of a man who has put down something heavy and is recalibrating his posture. Duff stayed. He developed into a capable foreman by the time he was 23, still occasionally unreliable at social events, but reliably excellent at the work, which was the more important category. Wierzbicki got his raise and the acknowledgement delivered by Silas with the brevity characteristic of significant Kane pronouncements, that he was the best horseman in the territory. Wierzbicki received this information without visible reaction and went back to work, which was how he received all information. The alliance outlasted Crow by years. It became something that newer ranchers in the valley joined as a matter of course, the way you joined because it existed and because your neighbors were in it, without necessarily knowing the specific history of why it had been built and what it had cost. Abigail found this both satisfying and faintly wry, that the structure survived its origins, that it became ordinary, which was perhaps the best possible outcome for something that had never been intended to be extraordinary in the first place. Fordham, in the way of men who take a long time to commit and then commit entirely, became one of the people she trusted most in the valley. He was not warm, and she was not particularly soft, and their friendship, if that was the right word, and she thought it probably was, operated on the register of two people who respected each other's practical intelligence and did not require the relationship to be anything other than what it was. Celia Marsh remained Celia Marsh, which was consistent and valuable. Margaret in Charlestown wrote every few months. Her bewilderment at Abigail's life faded gradually into something that read more like admiration, though Margaret was too New England to say so directly. She visited once, in the summer of the third year, and stood in the yard of the Kane Ranch with the expression of someone whose mental map is being substantially revised, and then went home and wrote a letter that was the warmest thing she had ever committed to paper. There were children eventually. 2, then 3. They grew up on the ranch with the particular competence of children who have been given real work and real responsibility, and whose parents are, whatever their other qualities, not fraudulent about what life requires. The oldest was her father's temperament, quiet, observing, the kind of child who processed things internally and then acted with a certainty that could look like stubbornness from the outside. The youngest was something else entirely, louder and quicker and interested in everything, which Abigail recognized with a rueful affection as a mirror she had not entirely expected. On a morning in the autumn of the 5th year, Abigail stood on the covered porch with coffee and looked out at the range and thought, "This is mine. Not mine as in owned, mine as in built, mine as in made from specific decisions and specific costs, and the application of everything she had to the specific circumstances she had found herself in without a plan and without certainty and without anyone telling her it would work." She had come to Wyoming with nothing she intended to bring and everything she actually needed, though she hadn't known the difference at the time. She was not the woman who had read an advertisement in the Boston Courier on a Tuesday morning. She was also, in every way that mattered, entirely herself. The same stubbornness, the same attention, the same refusal to mistake comfortable for right. Wyoming had not changed her. It had given her the circumstances to become what she already was, fully and without apology. Silas came out and stood beside her. He had been doing the morning accounts. He had learned to do them properly, which had taken longer than the other improvements, but which she considered a personal achievement of some significance. "North Fence," he said. "I know," she said. "I put it on the list." "You always put it on the list." Because it always needs attention, she said. He stood beside her and they both looked out at the range in the early morning light, at the cattle moving in the far pasture and the mountains north of the valley showing the first snow of the season and the fence that needed mending, because there was always a fence that needed mending, and you mended it because the work was the thing, and the thing was yours, and yours was enough, more than enough. It was in the specific and unsentimentalized way that she had come to understand all good things, exactly what she had been looking for when she didn't know what she was looking for, a place that was real, a life that was honestly made, and someone beside her who understood that the value of a thing was inseparable from the cost of building it. The morning light moved across the range. The cattle moved with it, and Abigail Kane stood on her porch, in her valley, in her life, and let it all be exactly what it was.